The monitor above the table screamed before Ren Iskender felt anything at all, and she was the calmest person in the room. She lay on her back under a lattice of cool blue light, right arm splayed open from shoulder to elbow. 3 alien surgeons bent over the wound with instruments that looked like glass spiders. The anesthetic block had failed 20 minutes into the procedure, a common enough hazard, they told her later. Human nerve chemistry ran hotter than the charts allowed for, and instead of the numb static she was supposed to feel, she felt every millimeter of the graft going in. She watched the ceiling. She counted her own breaths. She did not make a sound. "Vitals climbing," said the smallest of the 3 surgeons, a Thren named Sale Vantry, in the flat clinical Concord trade he used for every patient regardless of species. "Pain response is registering at levels that would have stopped a Kesh heart. She is not moving." "She is not sedated," said the surgeon beside him, adjusting a filament spool. "That is the part I do not like." Ren blinked at the ceiling and said, in the same voice she used to call out cargo weights on the bellwether docks, "Just finish it." None of them answered her. They finished it. That was how it started. Not with a scream, not with a fight, but with a woman lying still on a table while her own body refused to behave the way 3 centuries of conquered medical doctrine said it should. 6 days earlier, she had been standing in the number 4 hold of a freight hauler called the Corson Line, guiding a magnetized cargo pallet into its cradle with a hand signal, when the cradle's containment field stuttered for 0.4 of a second and 11 tons of compressed ore dropped its restraint. She had time to shove the junior rigger, a 19-year-old named Petra Osai, out from under the fall. She did not have time to get her own arm clear. The pallet's edge caught her shoulder and dragged her half a meter across the deck before the emergency clamps engaged. And by the time Des Okafor got to her, the whole right side of her body from collarbone to fingertips had gone the color of a bruised plum and stopped answering her. Des had held her down with both hands while she tried to sit up and check on Petra, and later, on the shuttle out to Bellwether Ring, he told her she'd said, very calmly, that her arm didn't work anymore and could somebody get her a coffee. He said it like it was funny. It was not funny to the trauma intake nurse at Bellwether, a squat blue-skinned Thren orderly who took one look at the scan and paged a specialist before Ren had finished giving her intake number. Bellwether Ring was the nearest conquered medical station with a human annex, a wheel of gray HAB modules turning slow around a border world called Castamere, 3 jumps out from the nearest conquered core system, and 1 jump out from the demarcation line that separated conquered space from whatever Earth had become since the Accord. Humans worked the ring on labor visas, dockhands, riggers, haulers, the jobs that needed strength and pain tolerance and didn't need much sympathy from the species running the paperwork. There were 41 humans registered on Bellwether that season. Ren was, as of that morning, the only one in surgery. The damage, once they got a proper scan on her, was worse than a bruise. The brachial plexus, the thick cable of nerve trunk that ran from her spine, under her collarbone, and out into her arm, had been crushed across a 4-centimeter span. Not severed. Crushed, which the Thren surgical literature considered worse, because crushed nerve tissue died slow and ugly instead of clean, and by the time Vantry got her under the scanning array the necrosis had already started creeping down toward her elbow. "We can excise the dead segment and bridge it," Vantry told her, standing at the foot of her recovery bed with a data slate in his long gray fingers, 2 hours after the failed anesthetic surgery, while she lay with her arm in a stasis cradle and her jaw still tight from having held it shut through the whole procedure. His eyes were the pale gold of a Thren who had spent a long career not being surprised by patients, and something in them had shifted since that morning. "It is standard technique. We use it on Kesh, on Orventi, on your own species when the visa contracts require it. A synthetic filament lattice, grown to your specific nerve architecture, laid into the gap. It does not restore full function on its own. It gives your body a bridge to grow across, very slowly over the following months. Most patients regain 60 to 70% mobility within a standard year. And if I don't do it, you lose the arm below the shoulder within 3 weeks. The necrosis does not stop on its own. Ren looked at her arm, wrapped and still, lying at an angle her body had never held it before, and said, "Then let's do the bridge. You understand the procedure will hurt. Your anesthetic response today was," he searched for the trade word, didn't find one he liked, used the blunt one instead, "unusual. We will attempt a stronger dose for the follow-up graft, but I want you aware." "I heard you the first time," Ren said. "I was there." Vantry looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he made a note on the slate and left, and that was the last ordinary day of the whole business, though nobody on Bellwether Ring knew it yet. The graft surgery went in 9 days later. This time the anesthetic held mostly, and Ren spent 4 hours under a haze thick enough that she only remembered fragments. The hum of the filament spinner, Vantry's voice reading numbers to an assistant, a strange cold pressure crawling up through her shoulder like water finding a new channel. When she woke in recovery, her arm was wrapped to the elbow in a translucent stasis sleeve, and through it she could see the graft site glowing faint blue where the synthetic lattice had been laid into the gap in her nerve trunk, a neat woven bridge no thicker than kite string, engineered down to the micron to carry an electrical signal from one living stump of nerve to the other and nothing more. It was not supposed to grow. It was not supposed to change. It was a bridge, not a seed. "Function will return gradually," Vantry told her, checking the readout clip to the sleeve. "You may feel intermittent sensation over the coming weeks as your body's own tissue begins to interface with the lattice at the margins. Report anything unusual. Otherwise, rest." Ren reported nothing unusual for 4 days, because for 4 days there was nothing to report. Her arm sat in the sleeve, numb and useless, and she lay in the human annex ward with the window shutter open to the slow gray turn of Castamere below, and she did the thing she had always done when her body was taken away from her for a while, which was to go very still on the inside and wait. The other bed in her section of the ward belonged to a wiry old man named Havard Meeks, 71 years old, 40 of them spent running cargo through 6 different systems, before a shipboard fire had taken most of the feeling out of his legs 11 years back, and a slow-conquered bureaucratic process had finally gotten him a graft slot on Bellwether. He'd had his own nerve bridge put in 9 months prior in his spine, and he still walked with a cane and a slight drag on the left side, but he walked. "They'll tell you it's a straight line," he said to her on the second day, watching her stare at the ceiling. "Slow, steady, boring as hell, and then one day you notice you can wiggle a finger you couldn't wiggle the week before. That's the whole show. Don't expect fireworks." "I don't expect anything," Ren said. "I'm just waiting to see what my arm decides to do." Havard laughed at that, a short dry bark, and said she had the right attitude for a labor visa human, which was the only kind of attitude that got you off Bellwether Ring in one piece. On the 5th day, the readout on her stasis sleeve went from a steady blue to an amber flicker for 6 seconds, and a nurse came to check it, and found nothing wrong and left. On the 7th day it happened again, longer this time, and the nurse ran a full scan and found nothing wrong and left again, faintly puzzled. On the 9th day, Ren woke at 4 in the morning with her right hand closed into a fist so tight the knuckles had gone white, and she had not closed it herself. She lay there a long moment, looking at her own hand doing something without her, and felt the first cold thread of something that was not quite fear thread through her chest. Then she reached over with her left hand, pried her right fingers open one at a time, and pressed the call button for the ward nurse, because whatever this was, it was not nothing, and Ren Iskander had never once in her life pretended a problem was smaller than it was. Vantry came himself at that hour, still in the loose gray sleep robe of Thren off-duty wear, and ran the scan twice before he said anything at all. "Your nerve conduction velocity in the graft segment," he said slowly, reading the second scan against the first, is 14% above baseline for an intact human nerve trunk. The graft was installed 9 days ago. It should be carrying no signal above passive background static for another 6 to 8 weeks, and even then only along the lattice itself, not beyond it. Meaning what? Meaning something in your body is not using the bridge I built for you, Vantry said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his flat clinical voice had a seam in it, a thing that might have been the beginning of unease. It appears to be growing its own. They moved her to a monitored room that afternoon, 1 floor down from the general ward, in a wing Havard called the fishbowl because the walls were half-transparent polymer, and the staff could watch you from the corridor without coming in. Wren didn't mind. She had spent enough of her life being watched by supervisors, safety inspectors, insurance drones, that one more set of eyes barely registered. What she minded was that nobody would tell her anything. "We are running comparative scans," Vantry said, on the first morning in the fishbowl, with 2 more monitors now clipped to her arm and a third strapped across her collarbone to read the spinal root. "Comparing your growth pattern against the archived nerve regeneration data for every species we have on file. I do not yet have an answer for you. You have a guess. I have several, and I do not like any of them enough to say them out loud yet." By the 3rd day in the fishbowl, the amber flickers on the readout had stopped being occasional and become continuous, a low, steady pulse of overactive signal running the whole length of her arm, and Wren could feel it now, not pain, not exactly, but a strange electric restlessness under the skin, like a limb that had fallen asleep and was now waking up violently and all at once, hour after hour, without ever finishing. Her fingers twitched in her sleep. She woke twice with her hand curled around the bed rail, hard enough to leave a mark in the padding. "Grip strength in the affected hand," said a Thren technician named Orsa, reading a fresh test off her slate on the 4th morning, in the careful neutral tone Wren was starting to recognize as the sound alien professionals made when they didn't want to alarm a patient, "is now measuring at 109% of your pre-injury baseline. In the arm that was, 10 days ago, necrotic." "Is that bad?" "It is not supposed to be possible," Orsa said, which was not the same answer, and Wren noticed that and filed it away. They ran her through a battery of tests that week that had nothing to do with the graft and everything to do with mapping what her body was doing instead of following it. Reflex hammer at the elbow, response time so fast the recording drone had to be recalibrated because it registered as equipment error the first 2 times. Pinprick sensation testing along the whole arm, meant to map the dead zones where nerve function hadn't returned yet, except there were no dead zones. The necrotic segment that Vantry had cut out and bridged 9 days before was, according to every test they ran, fully and evenly sensate, indistinguishable in function from her untouched left arm, in a period of time the medical literature said should have produced, at absolute best, the first faint whisper of returning pin sensation at the very margins of the graft. "I want to see the filament lattice," Vantry said, on the 6th day in the fishbowl, and ordered an imaging pass that used a soft violet scanning field instead of the usual gray, one that mapped tissue density down to individual fiber bundles. Wren lay still while the arm of the scanner passed slow over her shoulder and elbow, and watched Vantry's face while he read the output, because by now she had learned that his face, flat as it tried to stay, told her more than his voice did. He was quiet for 11 seconds. Wren counted them. "The lattice is gone," he said finally. "Gone where?" "Not removed. Consumed." He turned the slate so she could see it, though the imaging meant nothing to her, dense fields of false-color tissue mapped in blues and reds. "The synthetic filament I installed was engineered from an inert polymer base, chemically resistant to biological breakdown by design, specifically so that it would remain stable as a scaffold for decades. In 9 days, your body has broken down 81% of that polymer and replaced it, molecule by molecule, with living axon tissue of your own, not growing alongside the lattice, not growing through it, growing instead of it. Absorbing the bridge I built you, and using its structure as raw material to build something else. Ren flexed her hand. The fingers moved smooth and sure, faster than they had any right to, faster than they had moved before the accident even. Is that not just healing? Healing, Vantry said, does not consume medical-grade polymer as a nutrient source. I have performed this graft procedure 412 times, on 9 species. I have never seen tissue treat the bridge as food. Neither of them said anything for a while after that. Outside the fishbowl wall, a nurse walked past without looking in, and somewhere down the corridor, a Thren resident was arguing with someone about equipment calibration, and Ren lay on the bed and looked at her own hand, and thought, not for the first time in her life but more clearly than ever before, that her body had never once in 23 years asked her permission for anything it decided to do. What happens now, she said. Now, Vantry said, I file a report, and I do not yet know what I am going to put in it. The report went up the bellwether administrative chain faster than Vantry liked, because a night shift technician named Coral, running a routine data sync, had flagged the growth rate numbers as an anomaly before Vantry had finished drafting his own careful, qualified version. And by the time Ren woke on the 7th morning in the fishbowl, there was a new face standing at the foot of her bed that had nothing to do with medicine. He was Uksari. She'd seen a few of them on the ring, tall and lean, skin the deep green-gray of wet slate, a narrow-ridged skull and eyes that sat slightly too far apart to read easily as an expression. He wore a security officer's dark half-cloak over a Concord administrative uniform, no rank insignia visible but the kind of bearing that didn't need any, and he introduced himself in a voice pitched low and even, the voice of a man used to being listened to the first time. Administrator Corvith Ansu, he said, Concord Biological Compliance, Bellwether Station Office. I have read Dr. Vantry's preliminary filing. He glanced at the monitor above her bed, at the amber pulse still ticking along the display. You understand this is now a compliance matter, not only a medical one. I understand you're the 3rd new person to walk in here this week without telling me what that means, Ren said. Corvith's narrow eyes didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders did, a fractional tightening. It means, he said, that under Concord Treaty law, any biological process observed in a member or client species that demonstrates unregulated self-directed tissue augmentation, regeneration exceeding natural species baseline by a significant margin, occurring without external genetic or cybernetic intervention, falls under Article 40 of the Biological Compliance Accord. The article exists because 3 centuries ago, before the Accord, several client species used exactly this kind of self-augmenting tissue engineering to breed soldiers that could not be safely decommissioned. 2 of those species no longer exist as independent polities. The article is not decorative. Ren looked at him for a long moment. You think I'm a weapon? I think, Corvith said, with the exactness of a man choosing every word to be defensible later, that your body is currently doing something that, in any other species under Concord jurisdiction, would have triggered immediate quarantine and containment procedures 9 days ago. The fact that it has not yet done so is a courtesy to your treaty status as a client labor visa holder, and that courtesy has a limit. And what's the limit? That is what I am here to determine, Corvith said, and made a note on his own slate and left without another word, and Ren lay back against the pillow and felt, for the first time since the pallet had dropped on her 6 weeks ago, something that was almost not quite, but almost the shape of real concern. Havard found out about the visit within the hour, because Havard found out about everything on Bellwether within the hour, that being the particular genius of old men with nothing to do but sit in a ward and listen. Compliance, he said, shuffling into the fishbowl on his cane past a nurse who didn't stop him, because nobody stopped Havard Meeks from doing much of anything anymore. Girl, you want to know what that word means on a conquered station? It means somebody upstairs is scared, and scared people in uniform are the only thing worse than scared people without one. I'm not doing anything, Wren said. My arm is healing. Your arm, Havard said, lowering himself into the chair by her bed with a grunt, is healing about 40 years faster than any arm I've ever heard of on any species I've ever worked cargo next to, and I've worked cargo next to a lot of species, kid. You know what the aliens call Earth when they think we're not listening? Not officially. Not on the treaty paperwork. In the break rooms. No. Deathworld, Havard said. Same reason they don't like sending inspection teams down without full kit and a return flight already booked. Same reason they pay us extra hazard scale for jobs their own people won't touch barehanded. We don't heal like other client species, girl. We never have. It's just that up until now, nobody's had a reason to measure exactly how much faster, because up until now, nobody's cut one of us open and left something behind for us to eat. Wren looked down at her arm, smooth and strong and utterly hers, moving now with a speed and precision that felt less like recovery and more like an upgrade she hadn't asked for and couldn't return. That's not a comforting story, Havard. Wasn't meant to be comforting, the old man said. Meant to be true. There's a difference, and the sooner you learn it out here, the longer you keep both your arms. He nodded at her hand, still moving faster than it should, flexing and unflexing with a restless energy that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. That thing scares them because it should scare them. You're not broken, kid. You're just finally showing them what an intact one of us looks like. The tests kept coming, and so did the numbers, and none of the numbers made anyone on the medical staff relax. By the second week in the fishbowl, Wren's grip strength in the graft arm had climbed to 130% of baseline and showed no sign of leveling off. Her reflex times, tested with a simple drop-catch apparatus that Orsa ran twice a day now, had gone from merely fast to a number the recording equipment kept flagging as sensor error, until a second, faster piece of equipment was brought in from the station's main diagnostic bay to confirm it wasn't. Her pain threshold, tested with her consent, using a graduated nerve stimulation probe that Vantry administered personally and apologized for beforehand twice, which told her more than the test itself did, had risen high enough that she reported the top 3 settings as uncomfortable rather than painful, settings that Vantry said would have most Thren unconscious. It isn't only the graft arm anymore, Orsa told her, on the 11th day, comparing scans with a frown that had become her permanent expression around Wren. The regenerative signaling is beginning to cross the spinal midline. We're seeing elevated conduction velocity in your left arm now too, the one that was never injured. It's as though your nervous system, once triggered, doesn't know how to stop at the site of the original wound. It simply keeps optimizing. Optimizing for what? That, Orsa said, is the question Administrator Corvith wants answered before he decides what to do with you. Wren had started noticing it herself by then, in small ways that would have seemed like nothing on their own, but stacked up into something she couldn't ignore. She caught a falling data slate off the side table one afternoon without meaning to, her hand simply arriving under it before her mind had finished registering that it was falling. She heard the pitch of the ward's ventilation system change 3 seconds before a maintenance alert went out about it. She woke at night now not groggy but instantly, fully alert, the way she used to have to force herself awake for an emergency doc shift, except now it happened on its own, every time, whether there was an emergency or not. None of it felt like power. It felt like her own body had quietly, and without consultation decided it, no longer trusted the world to warn her about things in time, and had started arranging to warn itself. Orsa ran one more test that same week, almost as an afterthought at the end of a long session, a simple auditory discrimination check meant to establish a hearing baseline before the more invasive spinal root scans began. She stood at the far end of the fishbowl room, near the transparent wall, and read a list of quiet syllables into a directional microphone while Ren, eyes closed, was asked to repeat each one back. Ren repeated all of them correctly, without hesitation, and then, unprompted, repeated 3 more. Words Orsa hadn't spoken into the microphone at all, but had murmured, barely audible even to her own ears, to the technician standing beside her in the corridor outside, 40 feet away, and through a supposedly soundproofed wall, while double-checking the day's equipment calibration log. Orsa didn't say anything for a long moment. She simply looked at the readout, then at Ren, then wrote something on her slate with a hand that Ren noticed, watching her now with the same unwanted new precision. She noticed everything was not entirely steady. "That wall is rated to block conversational volume at 12 meters, Orsa said finally. You heard 3 words spoken at a whisper, through a wall, at more than 3 times that distance, while a directional microphone 2 meters from your own head was actively recording a completely different set of syllables at normal volume. I don't have a category for that result. I'm not sure our equipment does either." "Is that bad?" Ren asked, though by then she had mostly stopped expecting a clean answer to that question. "It isn't good or bad," Orsa said, closing the slate with more care than the gesture required. "It's just one more number I don't know where to file." Des came to see her on the 12th day, in through the fishbowl door with a nurse's badge waved him past, carrying a foil pouch of the terrible instant coffee from the annex vending unit because she'd told him, in the one message she'd managed to send off ward before the monitoring got tight, that she still owed herself that coffee from 6 weeks back and nobody had brought her one. "You look good," he said, which was a lie because she looked pale and wired and thinner than she'd been before the accident. But he said it anyway, the way you did for someone in a hospital bed, and she let him. "I feel," Ren said, taking the coffee and turning the pouch over in fingers that moved with a precision that made Dez's eyes flick to her hand and stay there a beat too long, like something that used to be broken and isn't sure how to stop fixing itself. "Petra's fine," Des said after a moment, because that was the thing they both actually needed to say and hadn't yet. She wanted to come. They wouldn't clear her past the visa desk, something about compliance restrictions on non-medical visitors right now. "She made me bring you this instead." He set a small carved wooden bird on the side table, crude and lopsided, clearly whittled fast by someone who wasn't good at it yet but wanted to be. "Said you saved her arm, and she figures that's worth more than a coffee." Ren picked up the little bird and turned it in her fingers, and for a moment the restless electric hum under her skin went quiet, or she stopped noticing it, which amounted to the same thing. "Tell her I said thanks." "I will." Des glanced toward the corridor, where a security officer in a dark half-cloak was standing at a discreet but very deliberate distance, watching. Not Corvith, a subordinate younger, less composed about hiding the fact that he was watching. "Ren, what's actually going on? The word on the docks is they're talking about moving you off-ring. Somewhere with a harder name than a hospital." "They think I might be dangerous," Ren said, in the same flat tone she'd have used to report a cargo discrepancy, "because my arm healed too fast." "That's insane." "It's their word, not mine, deathworlder." She said it carefully, testing the shape of it because Havard had used it 3 more times since the first, always half under his breath, always with a look on his face like a man handling something that could go off. "That's what they call us. Not to our faces mostly, because of stuff like this. Because apparently, on every other world they've got on file, if your body starts rewriting itself this fast, it means somebody built you that way on purpose, to be a weapon. Except nobody built me. I just fell under some ore." Des didn't say anything for a while, then he said quietly, "You scared?" Ren thought about that honestly, the way she tried to think about everything honestly, because there hadn't been much room in her life for lying to herself, and she'd never seen the appeal of starting. "No," she said. "Not of the arm. The arm's just doing what it does. I'm a little worried about what people who are scared of the arm might decide to do about it. She was right to be. She just didn't yet know how soon. The decision came down 2 days later, delivered not by Vantry, who had the grace to look like a man delivering news he disagreed with, but by Corvith Ansu himself, standing in the fishbowl doorway with a data slate held at his side like a weapon. He hadn't decided whether to draw. The Bellwether Compliance Board has reviewed Dr. Vantry's full case file, he said. Along with 3 independent species baseline analyses I commissioned from the Concord Biostandards Office. The consensus finding is that your regenerative profile constitutes an unclassified biological anomaly with characteristics consistent with self-directed augmentation, exceeding safe containment thresholds for a general medical facility. Say it in words I use on the docks, Wren said. Corvith's jaw, or the ridged plate that did the work of a jaw on his species, tightened. You are being transferred. There is a Concord Biological Research Annex 3 Jumps Core Ward, attached to a secure facility called the Halcyon Reach Station. It has containment protocols this facility does not. You will be studied there, under full medical support, until the mechanism behind your regeneration is understood well enough to be classified, and if necessary, controlled. For how long? Until it is understood, Corvith said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. Vantry, standing a half-step behind Corvith in the doorway, spoke up then, his flat clinical voice pitched with something that was almost an argument. Administrator, I want it on record that I do not concur with this classification. Everything we are observing is consistent with baseline human tissue biology operating at a scale we simply have never measured before, not with induced or weaponized augmentation. There is no foreign vector, no engineered signal. Her body is not being made into anything. It is behaving, as far as I can determine, exactly the way it is supposed to. Your objection is noted in the file, Doctor, Corvith said, without looking at him. It does not change the compliance requirement. Article 40 does not distinguish between augmentation that is engineered and augmentation that occurs naturally and exceeds threshold. The article is concerned with outcome, not intent. He turned back to Wren. Transport departs in 6 hours. You will be sedated for the transfer, for your own comfort and for procedural safety. And if I don't want to go? Your labor visa, Corvith said, is a Concord instrument, issued under Concord Treaty law, and it does not grant you the right to decline a compliance-mandated medical transfer. I understand this is difficult to hear. I would ask you to understand that I did not write Article 40, and I do not have the discretion to set it aside because I find you, personally, to be a calm and reasonable person. The article does not care whether you are calm. It cares what a body like yours has already proven it can do, and what it might do next if left unmeasured and unbound. He paused at the door. 6 hours, Ms. Iskander. I would suggest you rest. He left. Vantry lingered a moment longer, and in that moment his gold eyes met hers with an expression she hadn't seen on an alien face before. Something that might have been apology and might have been the particular helplessness of a man who had spent his whole career trusting a system that had just shown him one of its uglier corners. I filed everything honestly, he said, quiet. I want you to know that. Whatever happens now, it was not because I lied about what your body is doing. I believe you, Wren said, and meant it, and watched him go, and then lay alone in the fishbowl with the amber pulse still ticking steady along the monitor above her, 6 hours on the clock, and felt the restless electric hum under her skin settle, very slowly, into something colder and much more focused than restlessness. She was not going to Halcyon Reach. She had decided that with the same flat, unhurried certainty she'd once used to decide mid-fall, that Petra Osai was going to walk away from that cargo hold with 2 working arms even if it cost Wren one of hers. It was not a decision that came with fear attached. It never had. It simply arrived, whole and finished, and then the rest of her went about the business of making it true. She had 6 hours. She spent the first one doing nothing at all, lying still, breathing slow, letting the ward staff see exactly the calm, compliant patient they expected to sedate and load onto a transport. She spent the second one thinking, carefully, about doors, corridors, guard rotations, the location of the shuttle bay relative to the human annex, everything she had absorbed without meaning to in 6 weeks of lying in a monitored room with nothing to do but watch and listen and count. She had never planned an escape from anything in her life. It turned out her mind knew how to do it anyway, the same way her arm had known how to heal itself into something the whole Concord's medical literature had no name for. Deathworld, Havard had called it, not a compliment, not an insult either, just a word aliens used in break rooms for a place that had never once in its long, violent history built a nervous system that knew how to stay broken. Havard came by at the start of the third hour, moving slower than usual, cane tapping an uneven rhythm on the deck plating, and Wren understood before he said a word that he already knew. "Words around the ward," he said, settling into the chair by her bed with a grimace he didn't bother hiding. "Compliance transfer, halcyon reach." He said the name like it tasted bad. "I did 2 seasons of cargo runs through that system, girl, back before my legs went. You know what's out there? Nothing. A research station and a mining rock and about 400 kilometers of vacuum between the two. No independent shipping lanes. No consulate. No labor board rep to file a grievance with because there's nobody registered to live there who isn't already Concord staff. You go in on a compliance order. You come out when the compliance order says you can. And I have never once in 40 years heard of a compliance order on Article 40 getting lifted inside of a standard decade." "I'm not going," Wren said. Havard looked at her for a long moment, the lines around his eyes deepening, and then he did something she hadn't expected, which was to nod once, like a man confirming a number he'd already guessed. "Good," he said, "because I'll tell you something else I learned in 40 years out here, and you can take it or leave it. Every conquered species I've ever worked next to plans for trouble the same way. Committees, reviews, escalation ladders with 6 rungs on them before anybody's allowed to actually do the thing they're scared of. It's not cowardice exactly. It's just how a species that's never had to fight for its planet learns to handle a threat, slow, procedural, by the book, because the book has always worked before. They are going to send people to collect you in a few hours, and those people are going to follow a protocol, and that protocol is going to assume you're going to behave like every other species they've ever had to collect. Scared, compliant, slow to move because moving fast has never once been what's kept your kind alive. And I don't move like that." "No," Havard said. "You don't. None of us do, not really. We just spend our whole lives on this ring pretending to, because pretending keeps the visa paperwork clean. But you're not going to have the luxury of pretending in about 3 hours, kid, and I want you to understand something before that clock runs out." He leaned forward, both hands on the head of his cane, and his voice dropped lower, rougher, the performance of an old man's harmless chatter dropping away entirely. "You are not dangerous because you're going to hurt anybody. I've known you 6 weeks, and I've watched you give up your own dinner ration to a nurse's kid who wandered into the ward hungry. You're dangerous because you can, and you've never once needed to prove it, and that combination is the one thing in this whole Concord nobody quite knows how to write a compliance form for. Don't waste it proving anything. Just walk out of here the way you'd walk off a dock at the end of a shift. Calm, certain you're allowed to. Most trouble in this galaxy, human or otherwise, only escalates because somebody flinched first." Wren looked at the old man for a long moment, and something in her chest that had been coiled tight since Corvith's visit loosened, just slightly. "You've thought about this before. Tonight, I mean." "I've thought about it for 11 years, Havard said, pushing himself back up with a grunt, cane finding the floor. "Every human who's ever taken a labor visa out here has thought about it, whether they say so or not. We just never had a reason to test the theory." He paused at the door, and for a moment the dry humor came back into his face, though his eyes stayed serious. Go easy on them if it comes to it. They're not evil, most of them, just scared and running a system built by people even more scared than they are. Scared people in uniform, girl. Worst thing there is, right up until they meet somebody who isn't. He left. Ren lay back against the pillow, alone again, and looked at the wooden bird Des had left on the side table, and thought about Petra Osei walking off that cargo dock with 2 working arms, and let the last of the softness in her go quiet and still, the way it always had, right before the part of her that didn't ask permission took over. The extraction team arrived 40 minutes ahead of the stated transfer time, which told her, before they'd said a word, that somebody upstairs had decided the sedation window, and the 6-hour notice had both been a courtesy Ren hadn't earned, and had quietly moved the schedule up rather than risk giving her more time to think. There were 4 of them, 3 Uxari in light tactical harness, sidearms holstered but hands resting near them in a way that wasn't subtle, and Corvith Ansu himself at the rear of the group, not armed, standing with the particular stiffness of a man overseeing something he'd rather not be overseeing. "Ms. Iskander," Corvith said from the doorway, "transport is ready ahead of schedule. I'd like to proceed with minimal disruption to the ward." Ren was sitting up on the edge of the bed already, dressed in the plain gray annex clothes they'd given her, her graft arm resting easy at her side, fingers loose. She had not been asleep. She had not, in fact, taken her eyes off the corridor monitor mounted outside the fishbowl wall since the moment the schedule notification had blinked across it 11 minutes early, which was the first sign, and the 4 figures moving up the corridor with a purposeful stride that didn't match a routine transfer, which was the second. "You moved the time up," she said. "A precaution," Corvith said. "Given the nature of your condition, station protocol favors." "You were scared I'd have time to think," Ren said, not unkindly, just stating it the way she'd have stated a cargo weight. "That's fine. I've had 6 weeks. The lead Uxari officer, a broad-shouldered woman with a scar running pale across one cheek ridge, stepped forward with a restraint cuff already unclipped from her belt, standard procedure for a sedated transfer patient who was, in this case, very much not sedated. "Ms. Iskander, please extend your arm." "No," Ren said, and did not move, and the word landed in the small room with a flatness that made all 3 of the armed officers still for half a second, the particular stillness of people recalibrating a threat assessment in real time. "This is not a request," the lead officer said. "I understand that," Ren said. "I'm still not extending my arm." Corvith stepped forward, one hand raised, his voice pitched to de-escalate, the voice of a man who had clearly run this exact scenario in his head a dozen different ways and hadn't planned for the plain, unhurried refusal now sitting in front of him. "Ms. Iskander, I would strongly encourage you to cooperate. Compliance transfer procedures allow for reasonable physical restraint if a subject refuses voluntary transport, and I do not want this to become. You're going to put 4 people in a room with a woman whose nervous system you've spent 2 weeks telling me you don't understand," Ren said, standing now, slow, unthreatening, hands visible and open at her sides. "And you're going to have them grab her by the arm you already know heals faster than anything on your charts, and you think that's the safe option." Nobody answered her. In the silence, she could hear the low hum of the ward's ventilation, the tick of the monitor still logging her amber-pulsing vitals on the wall behind her, and under all of it, the restless electric current that had been building in her body for 2 weeks, finally, quietly, arriving at wherever it had been trying to get to this whole time. "Last chance to walk this back," Ren said to Corvith specifically, because some part of her still believed, even now, that he was a reasonable man caught inside an unreasonable machine. "Send me back to the ward. Let Vantry keep running his tests. I'm not going anywhere and I'm not hurting anyone. And you and I both know that's still true right up until the second your people put hands on me." Corvith's narrow eyes flicked to the lead officer, and for one long moment, Wren would think about that moment for a long time afterward, the exact length of the pause, the exact shape of the decision being made behind those unreadable eyes. It looked like he might actually say the word that would end this before it started. He didn't. "Proceed," he said, quiet, and stepped back, and the lead officer moved. The lead officer's hand closed around Wren's wrist, and Wren's arm was already gone from under it. It was not a fast motion, not the way violence looked in the recruitment vids Des used to laugh at on the mess deck screens back on the Corson line. No snarl, no wind-up, no shout. Wren simply turned her wrist a quarter of the way it could go, felt the officer's grip find nothing but empty air where a slower body would still have been, and stepped inside the reach of the arm that had tried to grab her instead of away from it, which was the one thing none of the 4 people in that room had trained to expect from a patient half sedated and 6 weeks off a crush injury. Her free hand found the inside of the officer's elbow and pressed, not hard, just correctly, the way you'd press a stuck cargo latch to find the give in it, and the officer's arm folded and her balance went with it, and she sat down hard on the fishbowl floor with a grunt of surprise more than pain. The second officer was already moving, reaching for the sidearm at his hip, and Wren crossed the 2 meters between them before his hand had finished closing around the grip. She did not go for the weapon. She went for the wrist holding it, guided it up and wide and into the wall beside the door hard enough that his fingers sprang open on reflex, and the weapon clattered to the floor, and she stepped past him, put her shoulder into his chest with just enough weight to take his feet out from under him, and let him fold down onto the bed she'd been sitting on 20 seconds earlier, more startled than hurt. The third officer had time to draw. He did not have time to aim. Wren's hand closed over the weapon and the wrist holding it in the same motion, and she did not wrestle it away from him, because wrestling took time, and time was the only thing in this room that still belonged to whoever moved first. Instead, she simply turned the barrel toward the floor, stepped into the space behind his shoulder, and used her own body weight and his forward momentum together to put him down beside his colleague. Slow enough that his head never touched the deck plating harder than a dropped cushion would have. The whole exchange took under 4 seconds. Nobody screamed. Nobody bled. 3 armed officers sat or lay on the fishbowl floor, disarmed and disoriented but essentially unhurt, and Wren Iskander stood in the middle of the room with her chest rising and falling at a perfectly normal rate, her graft arm loose at her side, her expression exactly as calm as it had been when she'd told Corvith last chance to walk this back. Corvith had not moved from the doorway. He stood very still, one hand half raised in the gesture he'd used to try to de-escalate a minute earlier, now frozen there, and his narrow far-set eyes moved from the lead officer picking herself up off the floor, to the second officer sitting stunned against the bed frame, to the third rubbing his wrist and staring at Wren with an expression that had gone all the way past fear into something closer to disbelief, and then last, to Wren herself. "You didn't hurt them," he said, and it came out less like an observation than a question he needed answered. "I didn't want to," Wren said. "I still don't. That was never the part I was worried about." She looked down at the weapon in her hand. She was still holding it, she realized, had taken it without quite deciding to, the same way her body had apparently decided a great many things over the last 2 weeks without consulting her first, and turned it, grip first, and set it down slowly on the bed rail rather than keep it, because keeping it would have made this into the kind of story Corvith's report could file under armed resistance, and Wren did not intend to give him that story. "I'm not leaving on that transport, Administrator, not because I want to fight. Because a fight was never going to be necessary if you just trusted your own doctor's report, instead of a 300-year-old article written for a war none of us fought." The lead officer, back on her feet now, hand going instinctively to the empty holster at her hip before she caught herself, looked at Corvith for instruction, and Corvith said nothing for a long moment, his eyes still on Ren, on the 3 disarmed and unbloodied officers standing around her in a room she had cleared in under 4 seconds without raising her voice once. "Stand down," he said finally, quiet, and the lead officer's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, relief she was too disciplined to show any other way. "All of you, return to the security office. I will handle this personally." He waited until the 3 of them had filed out past him into the corridor, the second officer still glancing back once, at Ren, with an expression she'd remember later as the first genuinely frightened look any alien on Bellwether had given her. And then he stepped fully into the fishbowl room, alone, and closed the door behind him, which Ren noted. Because it meant he had just chosen to be in a locked room alone with the exact thing his own compliance article said he should never be in a locked room alone with. "Why," he said, "did you disarm 3 trained officers in under 5 seconds and not break a single bone doing it?" "Because breaking bones wasn't the goal," Ren said. "The goal was to still be standing here, in one piece, having a conversation with you instead of being sedated onto a shuttle to a rock with no consulate on it. I got what I wanted. Nobody needed to bleed for me to get it." Corvith stood very still, processing that, and something in his rigid posture shifted, not relaxing exactly, but recalculating. The way a man recalculates when a number he'd assumed was fixed turns out to have been wrong the entire time. "Article 40, he said slowly, was written to identify species that engineer self-augmenting soldiers. The defining trait historically has always been escalation. A weapon once triggered does not stop until the threat is eliminated or the weapon is destroyed. That is the pattern in every case file I have ever read." He looked at the 3 fallen restraint cuffs still lying on the floor where the officers had dropped them. "You had every capability in this room in these last 5 seconds to eliminate 3 armed threats permanently. You did not use it." "No," Ren said, "I didn't." "Why?" Ren looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was quieter than it had been through the whole exchange. Quiet the way it had been when she told a 19-year-old rigger to get clear of a falling pallet 6 weeks ago, without a flicker of hesitation, because some decisions in her simply arrived finished and never needed to be argued with. "Because I didn't want to," she said. "That's the part your article never has a box for, administrator. You keep measuring what I can do. Nobody on this whole station has once asked me what I choose to do with it. That's not a loophole in your compliance framework. That's the entire answer." By the time Vantry reached the fishbowl, alerted by a ward nurse who had watched the whole thing through the transparent wall with her hand pressed over her mouth, Corvith had already opened a priority channel to the station's chief administrator, and the words coming through the earpiece clipped to his collar were tense enough that Ren could hear the tinny edge of them from across the room. "A full station lockdown is not proportionate to a contained incident with 0 casualties, Director, and I would ask you to let me finish my assessment before." Corvith stopped, listened, his jaw tightening. "Yes, I understand the article's language. I wrote half the enforcement guidance on it. I am telling you the situation on the ground does not match the threat model the article assumes." Another pause, longer. "Then send them. But I want it on record that I do not believe additional force is warranted, and I want Dr. Vantry present for any further contact with the subject." He closed the channel and turned to find Vantry already crouched beside the 3 restraint cuffs on the floor, examining them with the particular intensity of a man building a case. "Report says 3 officers were disarmed," Vantry said, not looking up. "It does not say injured." "They're not," Ren said. "Bruised, maybe. One of them's going to have a sore wrist." "That," Vantry said, straightening, "is going to be the single most important detail in this entire incident report, and I intend to make sure it is written in large enough letters that nobody upstairs can pretend not to have read it." He looked at Corvith. "Administrator." I have spent 2 weeks documenting a biological process that behaves exactly as I would expect an intact, undamaged human nervous system to behave under stress, once I stopped assuming it should behave like a Thren one. I now have 5 additional minutes of data suggesting that the same nervous system, under direct physical threat, defaults to minimum necessary force rather than maximum available force. I would like that entered into the compliance file before your director sends whatever she is currently threatening to send. She's sending a Tier 2 response team, Corvith said. Full containment kit. Sedative rounds, restraint field generators, a secondary compliance officer with authority to override my own if she judges the situation has escalated beyond local jurisdiction. He said it flatly, but Ren caught something underneath the flatness. Not quite regret, not yet, but the first crack in a man who had spent his whole career trusting the machine he worked inside of, watching it grind toward an outcome he was no longer sure was correct. When do they arrive? Vantry asked. 40 minutes. They were already staged at the secondary dock in case the transfer required additional support. Corvith's eyes went to Ren. I would ask you not to make my director's next 40 minutes any more complicated than they already are. I'm not going anywhere, Ren said. I've been saying that all morning. I'm not hiding, I'm not running, and I'm not going to hurt anyone who doesn't put their hands on me first. If your director wants to send a team to point sedative rounds at a woman sitting quietly in a hospital bed, that's a choice she's going to have to answer for, not me. She sat back down on the edge of the bed as she said it, deliberately, hands folded in her lap, and something about the plainness of the gesture. A woman simply sitting, in a hospital gown, in a room she had just cleared of 3 armed officers without raising her pulse, seemed to land harder on both aliens in the room than any argument could have. Havard arrived 9 minutes later, moving faster than Ren had ever seen him move, Kane striking the deck in a rapid, uneven rhythm, and behind him, Badge waved past a nurse too rattled by the morning's events to stop anyone, came Dez, white-faced, having heard the word lockdown over the annex comms and run the whole way from the dock levels. I heard 3 security officers got put on the floor, Havard said, wheezing slightly, stopping in the fishbowl doorway to take in the scene, Ren sitting calm on the bed, Corvith standing rigid near the wall, Vantry crouched over a slate full of data, 3 restraint cuffs still scattered on the floor. I wanted on record I did not think you'd actually need my advice about walking off a dock at the end of a shift. I thought that was a metaphor. It was, Ren said. Turns out it also works literally. Dez crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped just short of grabbing her, catching himself, glancing at her arm the way everyone on Bellwether now glanced at her arm, before he seemed to remember himself and pulled her into an actual hug instead, careful, like she might still be fragile, which after this morning was almost funny. They said you attacked a security team. I disarmed one, Ren said, into his shoulder. There's a difference, and I'm going to need everyone in this room to keep saying that difference out loud for the next 40 minutes, because apparently a Tier 2 response team is on its way, and I'd rather not have to demonstrate the difference a second time. Vantry looked up sharply from his slate. A Tier 2 team is designed for hostile bioweapon containment, sedative saturation rounds, field restraints rated for combat-grade augments. If they deploy that kit on a patient still actively regenerating peripheral nerve tissue at the rate hers is regenerating. He stopped himself, visibly recalculating the sentence, and when he continued his voice had gone tight in a way Ren hadn't heard from him before. A sedative dose calibrated for a hostile weaponized organism, administered to a biological system that is currently running at over 130% of baseline metabolic efficiency, carries a real risk of overdose. Nobody has modeled what a Tier 2 sedative load does to a human nervous system behaving the way hers currently is. There is no data. We would be finding out in real time on her. The room went quiet for a moment. Corvith's narrow eyes moved to the doorway, to to the corridor beyond, where the muffled sound of station announcements had shifted tone, a low amber advisory chime replacing the ordinary ambient hum. "Then I need to get to that dock before the team arrives," Corvith said, "and I need to tell them to hold position, and I am going to need every scrap of data you have, Doctor, and I am going to need it in the next 4 minutes, because I do not have the authority to countermand a Tier 2 deployment on my own judgment. I have the authority to buy time. That is all." "Then buy the time," Vantry said, already pulling data off his slate into a transferable packet. "I'll walk with you." He was at the door when Wren said his name, and he stopped and looked back at her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could have stayed out of it, filed your report, let the compliance machine grind through its process, kept your career clean. You didn't have to walk into that dock corridor and put your name on a data packet against your own director's response team." Vantry considered the question with the same careful, unhurried honesty he brought to every reading of every scan, and when he answered, his voice had lost the last of its clinical flatness entirely. 412 grafts, he said, 9 species. I have never once in my whole career watched a patient's body do something I could not explain by treating it as an injury trying to fix itself. Every other explanation I have been offered in the last 2 weeks has required me to believe that your body is instead trying to become a weapon. I do not believe that, Ms. Iskander. I have looked at the data too closely, for too long to believe it. And I am not willing to stand in a doorway and watch a compliance article designed for engineered soldiers get used on a woman whose only crime was healing from an accident faster than my instruments expected her to. That is not medicine. It is not compliance either, not really. It is fear wearing the paperwork of a procedure. He held her gaze a moment longer. "I will be back before that team reaches the dock, if I have anything to say about it." He left, and Corvith went with him, and the fishbowl room fell quiet except for the low amber advisory chime still pulsing somewhere down the corridor. And Havard lowered himself carefully into the chair by the bed, and Dez sat on the floor with his back against the wall because there wasn't another chair, and the 3 of them waited together for whatever was coming next. The waiting lasted 18 minutes, which was long enough for Wren to notice, with the same flat clarity she noticed everything now, that her pulse had never once climbed above its resting rate through the entire morning, not when the officer's hand had closed around her wrist, not now, waiting to find out whether a team of strangers with sedative rounds calibrated for something she wasn't would be walking through that door next. It was not bravery, she thought. Bravery implied a fear you were choosing to stand against. This was something else, something that had simply always been true about her, and had only now had a reason to show itself in a room full of people who'd never seen it before. Havard broke the silence first, in the low, dry voice he used when he wanted to fill a room without demanding anyone answer him. "You know what I remember most about my accident? The fire, I mean, the one that took my legs half out from under me. Wasn't the pain. Pain I could file away, deal with later. What I remember is how quiet the ship's medical bay went right after, when the Thren corpsman ran his first scan and just stood there a second too long before he said anything. That silence. I've heard it a few times since, out here. It's the sound of somebody realizing the rule book they trained on doesn't cover what's in front of them." He nodded toward the corridor. "That's the silence that just walked out of this room with Vantry and the administrator. Whatever's about to happen, it's not going to happen because anybody upstairs actually decided you're dangerous, kid. It's going to happen because a system that's never had to think about us properly ran out of boxes to put you in, and systems like that panic exactly the same way people do." "That's not comforting either," Dez said from the floor. "Wasn't trying to be," Havard said. "Trying to be accurate. There's a difference, same as before." The advisory chime in the corridor cut off abruptly at the 18-minute mark, replaced by silence, and then, a moment later, by the sound of footsteps, several sets, unhurried, approaching the fishbowl. Wren stood, not because she needed to, but because meeting whatever was coming on her feet felt like the correct thing to do, the way standing to receive a cargo manifest felt correct even when you could have signed it sitting down. It was Corvith who came through the door first, and behind him Vantry, and behind both of them, a third figure Wren hadn't seen before. An older Thren, her pale gray skin mottled with the deeper blue patches that Wren had learned from Havard, marked advanced age among their species, wearing an administrator's formal collar in a shade of deep violet that neither Corvith's nor Vantry's uniform carried. She moved into the room with unhurried authority, the particular unhurried authority of someone who had spent decades being the most senior person in every room she entered, and her pale gold eyes went first to the scattered restraint cuffs still on the floor, then to Wren, standing calm beside the bed, and stayed there for a long, assessing moment. "Chief Administrator Enal Vashter," she said, "Bellwether Ring Station Command. I am told you disarmed 3 of my security officers in under 5 seconds and left every one of them ambulatory." "That's correct," Wren said. "I'm also told," Vashter continued, "that you have spent the last 20 minutes sitting quietly in this room, in a hospital gown, while my Tier 2 response team held position at the secondary dock, because Dr. Vantry and Administrator Ansu jointly petitioned my office to reconsider a deployment neither of them believed was medically or procedurally sound." She glanced at Vantry, at Corvith, something unreadable passing across her face. "In 11 years as chief administrator of this station, I have had exactly one prior occasion where a compliance officer petitioned against his own director's authorized response. I did not enjoy either occasion. I am, however, capable of recognizing when 2 of my most trusted staff are telling me the same uncomfortable thing from 2 different directions, and I have learned over 11 years to listen when that happens." She stepped further into the room, closer to Wren than either Corvith or Vantry had come since the incident, and there was nothing in her posture that read as fear, only careful, professional attention, the attention of a woman who had built a long career on not letting first impressions decide anything for her. "I have read Dr. Vantry's full case file," Vashter said. "I have read Administrator Ansu's incident report, filed 9 minutes ago, which, and I want you to understand how unusual this is, recommends against further Article 40 escalation, and requests an emergency compliance review instead of continued containment procedure. I do not make decisions of this magnitude on the word of 2 staff members alone, however sound their judgment. I am ordering a full compliance review board, convened here on Bellwether within 48 hours, with representation from the Concord Biostandards Office, independent medical assessment, and because I have found over 11 years that the people closest to a situation frequently see things committees do not, testimony from you directly, Ms. Iskander, and from anyone else on this station who has relevant observation to offer." "And until then?" Corvith asked. "Until then," Vashter said, "Ms. Iskander remains on Bellwether in this ward under Dr. Vantry's medical supervision and no one else's. No transfer, no further restraint attempts. No Tier 2 deployment without my direct, personal authorization, which I do not currently intend to give." She turned back to Wren, and something in her expression shifted, not quite warmth, but a kind of clear-eyed respect that hadn't been there when she'd walked in. "I will tell you plainly, Ms. Iskander, because I find plainness saves time in situations like this one. I do not yet know what your body is or what it means for how the Concord classifies your species going forward. I have run this station for 11 years, and I have never seen an incident like this one resolve with 0 injuries when every precedent in my files says it should have resolved with at least 1 death. That fact alone earns you 48 hours of my station's patience. What you do with those 48 hours is going to matter a great deal to how this ends." "I don't intend to do anything with them," Wren said, "except keep being exactly what I've been the whole time, a dockhand who got hurt on the job and healed." Vashter looked at her for a long moment, and something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "That," she said, "may turn out to be the single most disarming thing anyone says to this board in the next 48 hours. See that you say it exactly that way when the time comes." Word of the incident moved through Bellwether Ring faster than any official channel could contain it, and by the second day of the 48-hour window, Wren had learned that a hospital ward with transparent walls was a poor place to hide from the consequences of becoming a story. She saw it first in the way the nurses' rounds changed. Not colder, exactly, but more careful, more deliberate. The particular carefulness of people who had spent their whole careers thinking they understood a species and had just been shown, in under 5 seconds, that they did not. She saw it in the 2 additional security officers stationed permanently in the corridor outside the fishbowl, not there to restrain her, Corvith had explained stiffly, but there, because station protocol required a security presence near any subject under active compliance review, and Wren had let that explanation stand without arguing it, because arguing every small indignity of the next 48 hours would have cost her more than it earned her. She saw it, too, in Petra Osei, finally cleared past the visa desk on the second morning, who came into the ward not with flowers or another carved bird, but with a data slate of her own, chin set in the particular stubborn line Wren recognized from 6 weeks of working cargo shifts beside her. "I want to testify," Petra said, before Wren had even finished sitting up. "At the review board. Des already put in a request too. We were both there when the pallet came down. I want them to hear what actually happened, not just what the scans say." "You don't have to do that," Wren said. "It's not your fight." "You put your whole arm under 11 tons of ore so it wouldn't land on me," Petra said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first real crack Wren had heard from her since the accident. "I don't get a say in whether it's my fight. It became my fight the second you decided that. So yes, I'm testifying and you're not talking me out of it, and if you try I'm bringing Des in to back me up and he's even more stubborn about this than I am." Wren didn't argue. She had learned over 23 years that some kindnesses were not actually yours to refuse on someone else's behalf, and this was one of them. The Compliance Review Board, when the details of its composition reached her through Vantry on the second afternoon, turned out to be larger and more consequential than Wren had initially understood. It was not, as she'd first assumed, a local bellwether matter to be quietly resolved and filed. Chief Administrator Vashtor's emergency convening request had triggered an automatic escalation clause in the Concord Biostandards Charter. Any Article 40 review that involved an entire client species for the first time, rather than an isolated individual case, required representation from the Concord's Central Compliance Office, 3 Jumps Core Ward, and that office had, in the 18 hours since Vashtor's request went out, assigned a senior arbitrator to preside in person rather than by remote link, which Vantry told her, in his careful clinical way, was itself an unusual signal. "They do not send senior arbitrators in person for routine matters," he said, on the second evening, reviewing a fresh scan of her arm that had, by now, stopped surprising either of them with its numbers. "They send them when a decision is likely to set precedent that will be cited for the next century. Whatever happens in that room in 2 days, Ms. Iskander, is very likely to become the baseline classification for every human who ever takes a Concord labor visa after you. Not just on Bellwether, everywhere." "No pressure," Wren said flat. "I did not say it to create pressure," Vantry said. "I said it because I think you should understand the stakes precisely, the way you seem to understand everything else precisely, rather than have them arrive as a surprise in the room." She thought about that for a while after he left, not the fear of it, because fear had never been the shape her mind took under pressure, but the weight of it, the particular weight of knowing that whatever she said in that room in 2 days would land not just on her, but on every dockhand, every rigger, every hauler on every Concord station who happened to share her species and her nervous system. She thought about the 40 other humans registered on Bellwether that season, about Des and Petra, and the 19-year-old girl she'd shoved clear of a falling pallet without a second's hesitation, about Havard, 71 years old with a slow drag in his left leg, and 11 years of watching this exact machine grind slower and more carefully around a species it had never quite known what to do with. On the morning of the third day, 4 hours before the review board convened, Corvith Ansu came to the fishbowl alone, without his half-cloak, without the rigid formal bearing he'd carried through every previous visit, and stood at the foot of her bed the way he had on the very first day, except this time he did not open with a citation. "I want to tell you something before the board convenes," he said, "that I would not have said 3 days ago." He paused, choosing his words with the same exactness he always used, but the exactness now seemed aimed at honesty rather than deniability. "I have spent 11 years enforcing Article 40. I have seen it applied 9 times, on 9 different species, and in every prior case, the subject either could not or would not explain, when I asked, why they had not used the full extent of their capability against my officers. Most could not answer the question at all. The augmentation had overridden whatever judgment they might once have had. 2 answered that they had simply not had the opportunity yet. You are the first person I have ever asked that question who answered that you had the opportunity and chose not to take it, and meant it plainly enough that I believed you before I had any data to support believing you." He met her eyes. "I do not know what that means for how the board will rule. I only know that I intend to say it to them exactly as I have said it to you, and I wanted you to hear it from me first, rather than read it cold in a transcript." "Thank you," Wren said, and meant it, the way she'd meant it with Vantry 3 days earlier. "Do not thank me yet," Corvith said. "I am still the man who tried to sedate you onto a shuttle 4 days ago. I would rather you judge me on what I say in that room in 4 hours than on what I have already said to you in this one." He turned to go, then stopped at the door, and something almost like humor crossed his narrow face, dry and brief. "For what it is worth, Ms. Iskander, my officer with the sore wrist, has already told the story to half the security office. She does not tell it as a complaint. She tells it, I am given to understand, as the single most professionally executed disarming she has ever been on the receiving end of. I believe the exact phrase she used was that she has trained junior officers for 6 years, and none of them move like that on their best day." He inclined his head, a gesture Wren had come to recognize, in 3 days of watching Aksari body language, as something close to respect. "Whatever else this board decides, you have already changed how at least a few people on this station think about your species. That is not nothing." He left, and Wren sat alone in the fishbowl for the last quiet hour before the hearing, and looked down at her arm, steady, sure, humming with a low current that had stopped feeling foreign somewhere in the last 3 days, and had started instead to feel simply like the rest of her, only more honest about what it had always been capable of, and thought that whatever the board decided in 4 hours, something in the room this morning had already shifted for good, and no ruling, however it came down, was going to put that back the way it had been. The review board convened in the largest conference chamber on Bellwether Ring, a long oval room usually reserved for cargo arbitration disputes between shipping consortiums, its far wall a single broad viewport that looked out over the slow gray turn of Castamere below. Wren had never been inside it. She noted, walking in flanked by Vantry on one side and, at her own quiet insistence, Havard on the other, Kane tapping steady against the deck, that the room had been arranged with a long curved table at the front for the board itself and rows of simple chairs facing it, and that every one of those chairs was full. 41 humans worked Bellwether Ring that season. 38 of them were in that room. Wren recognized faces from the docks she'd never had a real conversation with, riggers and haulers and cargo clerks who had, she understood now, all heard some version of the story over the last 3 days and had all, independently, decided this was worth using their off-shift hours to witness. The senior arbitrator sat at the center of the curved table, an orventi, a species Wren had seen only twice before on the ring, tall and narrow-shouldered with pale silver-threaded skin, and an unhurried, deliberate way of moving that reminded her, oddly, of Vantry's clinical stillness scaled up into something with real institutional weight behind it. Beside the arbitrator sat Chief Administrator Vaster, and beside Vaster, looking smaller than Wren had ever seen him look, Corvith Ansu, no longer standing at the edge of a room but seated at its center table, a full participant in whatever judgment was about to be rendered. "This board is convened," the arbitrator said, in a voice that carried without needing volume, "to review an Article 40 compliance matter with implications extending beyond the individual case before us. I have read the full file. I have reviewed Dr. Vantry's medical documentation, Administrator Ansu's incident reports, both the original transfer order and the subsequent revision, and Chief Administrator Vaster's emergency convening request. I intend to hear from the subject directly, from relevant witnesses, and from Dr. Vantry before rendering a preliminary finding. Ms. Iskander, you may begin if you are willing." Wren stood because it felt correct to stand, the same way it had felt correct to stand when the extraction team came through the fishbowl door, and she found, looking out at the room full of faces both human and alien, that the same flat, unhurried calm that had carried her through the accident, through the surgery, through the failed extraction was still there, steady under her ribs, and she let it carry her now. "6 weeks ago I got hurt doing my job," she said. 11 tons of ore came down on a containment failure, and I put my arm where it would land instead of letting it land on a 19-year-old who's sitting in this room right now. Dr. Vantry fixed the damage the way his training told him to fix it. My body didn't stick to the plan. It kept healing past the point where healing was supposed to stop, and everyone got scared, because a body that keeps healing past the point where it's supposed to stop looks on paper exactly like the kind of thing your Article 40 was written to catch. She paused. Let that sit a moment. I understand why. I've read enough of the file myself now to understand the history behind it. I'm not asking this board to pretend that fear wasn't reasonable 3 days ago before anyone had data. I'm asking it to look at the data now. And if the data suggests, the arbitrator said, not unkindly, that your species' baseline capability represents a genuine and unclassified risk, not maliciously engineered, but no less real for being natural. The article does not distinguish, Ms. Iskander, between a threat that was built and a threat that simply is. Then I'd ask the board to consider something Dr. Vantry pointed out to me 3 days ago, Wren said, which is that in 11 years of running this station, in 9 prior applications of Article 40 on 9 other species, this is the first incident that resolved with 0 deaths, 0 permanent injuries, and a security officer who's apparently telling her colleagues it was the most professional restraint she's ever been on the receiving end of. I didn't do that because your article told me to. I did it because that's what I choose every time when the choice is mine to make. You can measure what my body is capable of for the next 100 years, and you'll never find a number for that. It's not a number. It's a decision, and I make it fresh every single time, the same way every person in this room makes it, human or otherwise, when they decide not to do the worst thing they're capable of. The arbitrator was quiet for a long moment, unreadable, and then turned to Vantry. Doctor, your medical assessment. Vantry stood and delivered what Wren would later think of as the most thorough, careful, unhurried piece of testimony she had ever heard, walking the board through 412 prior grafts, through the specific data on nerve conduction velocity and tissue consumption rates, through the comparative baseline studies he'd run against every species on file, and through, finally, the thing he'd told her himself 3 days earlier, that every measurement he had taken pointed toward an intact biological system operating exactly as designed, not augmented, Not engineered, simply faster and more resilient at its baseline than any species the conquered had previously catalogued. "I have practiced medicine for 31 years, he said, closing. "I have never before had cause to revise my understanding of a species' fundamental biology this significantly, this quickly. I want to be precise about what I am telling this board, because precision matters more here than anywhere else in my career. Humans are not augmented. They are not weaponized. They are, as far as I can determine, simply what an organism looks like when it evolves on a world that never once let its nervous systems rest. Every prior client species the conquered has catalogued comes from a world with an apex predator that has, over evolutionary time, been managed, culled, or otherwise brought into balance with its environment. Every species file I have cross-referenced this week describes a homeworld with, at most, 1 or 2 genuine apex threats. Ms. Iskander's world file lists 61 apex-tier predator species still extant on Earth at the time first contact was made, alongside a client species, hers, that outcompeted every one of them for the top of that hierarchy without the benefit of natural weapons, armor, venom, or size. I do not think what we are seeing in her nerve regeneration is an anomaly, board members. I think it is the baseline we should have expected from the beginning, and did not, because we had never before had a dataset complete enough to know what we were looking at." Petra testified next, in a voice that shook at the start and steadied by the end, describing the exact 0.4 of a second before the pallet dropped, and the shape of Wren's shoulder already moving to put itself between Petra and 11 tons of ore before either of them had consciously decided anything. Des testified after her, shorter, blunter, describing the calm voice asking about coffee while her arm hung dead at her side. Havard testified last among the humans, leaning on his cane, and told the board in his dry, unhurried way that he had known Wren Iskander for 6 weeks, and had watched her give up her own dinner ration to a hungry child before he'd ever once watched her raise her voice, and that in his considered opinion, gathered over 40 years working cargo beside 11 different conquered species, the single most dangerous thing about humans was not what they could do, but how rarely, given the choice, they chose to do it. The board deliberated for 40 minutes, in full view of the room, murmuring among themselves at the curved table, while the humans and the handful of alien staff who had come to watch sat in a silence that felt, to Wren, less like tension than like a held breath. The whole station had been holding for 3 days, finally starting slowly to release. When the arbitrator spoke again, the room went fully still. "This board finds," the Orventi said, "that the biological process observed in the subject, Wren Iskander, and by extension the human species baseline it represents, does not meet the threshold for classification as unregulated self-directed augmentation under Article 40. The process is natural, unengineered, and consistent, per Dr. Vantry's documentation, with the species' evolutionary baseline. This board further finds that the incident of physical resistance to compliance transfer, while technically a violation of transfer procedure, was conducted with a demonstrated and documented restraint that this board considers, frankly, without precedent in the file of any prior Article 40 case." A pause, and something in the arbitrator's careful, unhurried voice shifted, took on a weight that was almost, though not quite, personal. "This board recommends, effective immediately, that the human species designation on file with the Concord Biostandards Office be revised from provisional client labor status to a new formal category, Deathworld Baseline, Class 14, acknowledging both the exceptional physical resilience of the species and the demonstrated behavioral restraint that accompanies it. This board further recommends that Article 40 enforcement guidance be amended to explicitly exclude documented natural regenerative baselines from augmentation classification, effective across all conquered territories, pending full ratification by the Central Compliance Office." He looked at Wren directly, for the first time since the hearing had opened. "Ms. Iskander, This board owes you an apology it cannot formally enter into the record, so I will offer it here instead, plainly. You were nearly transferred to a containment facility on the basis of fear rather than evidence. That should not have happened. I am glad, for reasons that go beyond this file, that it did not end worse than it did. The room did not erupt into cheering, the way Wren half expected some part of her mind that had grown up watching old vids to want it to. It simply exhaled, 38 human dockhands and riggers and cargo clerks and a scattering of station staff, a long collective release of tension held for 3 days, and beside her, Havard reached over with one gnarled hand and gripped her shoulder, once hard, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the room hadn't already said for him. The weeks that followed did not feel, to Wren, like the beginning of a new chapter so much as the slow, unglamorous work of learning to live inside a body that had quietly renegotiated its own terms without asking her first. Vantry kept her on bellwether another month past the point where her graft would ordinarily have been considered fully healed, not out of any remaining compliance concern. The board's finding had closed that file for good, and a formal notice had gone out to every conquered station with a human labor annex within the first week, reclassifying the species designation station-wide. But because, as he put it, in the careful clinical way that Wren had come to understand was simply how he loved his work, there was more to learn from her than either of them had expected, and she had, somewhere in the last several weeks, stopped minding being the subject of that learning, because it no longer felt like being studied. It felt like being asked good questions by someone who had earned the right to ask them. "Your reflex arc is still shortening," he told her, on a morning 6 weeks after the hearing, reviewing a scan that had become routine rather than alarming. "Not dramatically, a fraction of a percent every few days. I suspect it will plateau eventually, once your nervous system finishes whatever recalibration the injury triggered, but I confess I no longer feel confident predicting where that plateau sits. Every time I think I have found your ceiling, you demonstrate that I was measuring the wrong wall. Is that going to be a problem?" "Only," Vantry said, "in the sense that I now have to rewrite 3 separate sections of the standard human surgical protocol before I can safely operate on the next patient your species sends me, which I am told, as of this month, is going to be considerably more of them. Bellwether's labor visa office has already logged a 40% increase in applications since the reclassification went out." He looked up from the slate, something that might have been dry amusement in his gold eyes. "It appears your species has decided that a formal conquered designation acknowledging you as, in the layman's phrasing I keep hearing from the dock crews, too dangerous to mess with, is something of a selling point back on Earth." Wren laughed at that, the first real laugh she'd let herself have since the accident, and found that it came easier than it used to, the restless electric current under her skin having settled, over the weeks, into something less like an alarm and more like a low, steady hum that felt, increasingly, like the ordinary background noise of simply being herself. She spent the extra month learning her own new limits with the same patient thoroughness she'd once used to learn cargo weights and clamp tolerances. Sparring, carefully, and at reduced intensity, with 2 of the security officers who'd been in the fishbowl that first morning, both of whom had asked, to Corvith's visible surprise, to volunteer for the sessions once word got around that Wren had specifically requested training partners rather than isolation. The scarred lead officer, whose name turned out to be Ressa, took to the sessions with a professional curiosity that gradually shaded into something like genuine friendship. And by the 3rd week, she was laughing freely, at the exact moment Wren's hand closed around her wrist before her own reflexes had finished registering the movement. "I train junior officers for a living," Ressa said, catching her breath after a session in the 3rd week, sitting on the mat with her back against the practice room wall. "I have never once had a student learn control this fast. You're not even trying to be gentle with me anymore, you're just accurate. There's a difference, and I didn't understand it until you showed me." "Havard's line," Wren said, "not mine. He's been saying it about half the important things on the station since the day I met him." "Then somebody should put the old man on the compliance review board," Ressa said. "He'd have saved everybody 3 days of paperwork." Petra visited most evenings that month, no longer needing a special clearance now that the human annex restrictions had lifted, and somewhere in the easy rhythm of those visits, Wren found herself teaching the younger woman the same careful, deliberate stillness that Havard had tried to teach her. Not because Petra's nervous system needed it the way Wren's had, but because Petra had watched a pallet nearly kill her and had spent 6 weeks since jumping at every loud noise on the dock floor. And Wren recognized in that flinch a kind of damage that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the part of a person that decided, after something terrible almost happened, whether the world was still safe to move through without flinching. "You don't flinch," Petra said one evening, watching Wren's hands work steady and sure through a maintenance check on a spare cargo clamp Vantry had let her borrow for something to do with her hands. "Even before all this, even at the accident, how?" Wren thought about that for a while before she answered, turning the clamp over, testing its give. "I used to think it was just how I was built," she said finally. "Stubborn, my mother called it when I was your age. Turns out it might be a little more literal than that. But I don't think the not flinching is the important part, Petra. I think the important part is what you do in the second after you flinch. Everybody flinches. The dock's loud, the work's dangerous. That's just true. What matters is whether the flinch gets to decide what happens next, or whether you do." It was not, she thought, watching Petra turn that over with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything. A lesson she could have taught 6 weeks earlier, before an 11-ton pallet and a failed anesthetic block, and a compliance board had spent 2 months rebuilding, piece by piece, her understanding of what her own body actually was. Some lessons only arrived once you'd survived the thing that taught them to you. News of the reclassification reached further than Bellwether, faster than Wren expected. Vantry forwarded her, on a quiet evening in the 7th week, a message that had come through the Concord's medical data network from a station 3 systems over. A junior Thren physician there, treating a human dockhand for a crush injury disturbingly similar to Wren's own, had pulled up the amended surgical protocol before beginning the graft, seen the annotation referencing Bellwether case file designation Deathworld baseline, class 14, and had, instead of panicking when the patient's nerve conduction numbers began climbing past expected recovery curves 3 days later, simply logged the readings, cross-referenced the protocol, and told the patient calmly that everything appeared to be within the new expected range for their species. "That patient," Vantry said, showing her the message, "is currently sitting up in a recovery ward 140 light-years from here, healing fast, unafraid, and entirely unaware that the reason nobody panicked when his hand started closing into fists on its own was a woman he has never met and will probably never know by name." Wren looked at the message for a long time, at the clinical, unremarkable notation buried in a routine medical log, and thought that this, not the hearing, not the board's formal apology, not even the reclassification notice itself, was the part of the last 2 months that actually mattered. Not the moment she'd been believed. The moment, 140 light-years away, when someone else hadn't had to fight to be. Chief Administrator Vashter summoned her to the station command offices near the end of the 7th week, not as a compliance matter this time, but, the message specified, as a conversation about what came next, and Wren went alone, on her own 2 feet, through corridors where the security officers posted at the ward door nodded to her now instead of watching her. Vashter's office looked out over the same slow gray turn of Castamere that the hearing chamber had, though from a different angle, and the older Thren woman was standing at the viewport when Wren came in, hands folded behind her back in a posture Wren recognized now as her thinking posture. "Your medical hold ends in 9 days, Vashter said, without turning around immediately. Dr. Vantry tells me there is nothing left for him to monitor that couldn't be handled by routine follow-up, which means in 9 days, you are a free labor visa worker again, entitled to return to your dock assignment, or to apply for reassignment, or, for that matter, to return to Earth on the next available transport, if that is what you want. She turned then, and her pale gold eyes were steady, assessing, the same eyes that had walked into the fishbowl 8 weeks ago and found 3 armed officers on the floor. I would like to make you an offer before you decide. I'm listening. Bellwether is about to see a significant increase in human labor visa applications, Vaster said, as word of the reclassification spreads. Dr. Vantry has already told me the surgical protocols for your species require substantial revision, and that revision is going to be needed at every conquered station with a human annex, not just this one. I would like to offer you a formal position, not dock work, though you may keep doing that too if you wish it. I understand it means something to you, but a consulting role, station liaison for human medical and labor affairs, working directly with Dr. Vantry's team and with my own compliance office, helping us get this right for the next Ren Iskander before she ends up on a table with a failed anesthetic block and a doctor who doesn't yet know what he's looking at. Ren was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same slow curve of the planet below, thinking about the message from 140 light-years away, about a stranger who hadn't had to fight for his own body to be believed. "Why me?" she asked. "There are 40 other humans on this station. Any one of them could do a version of this job." "Because," Vaster said, "you are the only one of them who, 4 minutes into an armed extraction attempt, chose restraint over the full extent of what you were capable of, and then chose, an hour later, to sit in front of a room full of frightened aliens and explain, patiently, without anger, without a single wasted word, why that restraint was the point. That is not a skill I can hire for Ms. Iskander. It is not even, strictly, a medical fact. It is a kind of judgment I have seen perhaps 4 times in 11 years running this station, and never once from someone your species compliance office would have called, 8 weeks ago, dangerously unclassified." Ren thought about Earth then, properly, for the first time in weeks, the small coastal town where she'd grown up, her mother's dry, stubborn voice, the particular gray light over water in the mornings before a work shift, a life she had left behind for a labor visa and a hazard scale wage, and had not, until this moment, seriously considered returning to. She thought about Des and Petra, about Havard's dry, unhurried wisdom, about Ressa laughing on a practice mat, about Vantry's careful gold eyes reading a scan like it was the most interesting thing he'd seen in 31 years. She thought, too, about the arm at her side, steady and sure and entirely hers, and about what it might mean to spend the next stretch of her life making sure nobody else had to learn what it was capable of the hard way. "I'll take the position," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "I want it written into the protocol, formally, on record, that no human patient on this station or any other ever gets scheduled for a nerve graft without being told, up front, in plain language, exactly what might happen and why nobody needs to be afraid of it. I spent 2 weeks not knowing whether my own body was betraying me or saving me, because nobody had the data to tell me which. I don't want the next person to spend even 2 days like that." Vaster considered this, and then nodded, once, the same unhurried, decisive nod Ren had come to recognize as the woman's way of closing a matter for good. "Done," she said. "Welcome to Bellwether Command, Ms. Iskander. I suspect you are about to make Dr. Vantry's professional life a great deal more interesting." She did. Over the following months, the protocol Ren had demanded became the template that Vantry's revised surgical guidance carried to every conquered station that treated human patients, a plain-language briefing document that started, at Ren's own insistence, with the words, "Your nervous system is not broken, and it is not a weapon. It is simply built for a world that never gave it permission to rest, and ended with a list of what a patient could expect to feel, in order, over the weeks following a graft, written by someone who had felt every item on that list herself and had not had the mercy of a warning. Havard retired from the ward 2 months later, his own spine graft finally, after 11 slow years, fully knit, the drag in his left leg gone for good, and on his last morning in the annex, he found Wren at the practice mats running a slow, controlled drill with Ressa, and stood in the doorway watching for a while before either of them noticed him. "Look at you," he said, when Wren finally caught sight of him and stopped mid-motion. "Liaison office, surgical protocols with your name buried in the footnotes, security officers who used to be scared of you asking you to spar with them for fun. 11 years I spent watching this station grind slow and careful around people like us, girl, and you went and changed the whole shape of it in about 8 weeks. I had help," Wren said. "An old man told me not to flinch first." "An old man told you a lot of things," Havard said, "because an old man had a lot of years to figure them out the hard way, and precious little else to do with them besides pass them along to somebody who'd actually use them." He extended a hand, no cane in it now, steady on his own 2 feet for the first time since she'd met him, and Wren shook it, and neither of them said anything else, because neither of them needed to. The call came through Wren's liaison office 4 months into the new position, flagged urgent by a night shift comms officer, and she was in the small converted dockside room that served as her office, a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out on the same gray turn of Castamere she'd been watching for the better part of a year now. When she opened the channel and found herself looking at a Thren physician she'd never met, on a station called Marrow's Anchor, 4 jumps out. Her gold eyes wide with the particular strain of someone who had run out of protocol to follow. "Ms. Iskander," the physician said, "forgive the hour. I was given your contact by the Concord Medical Network as the designated human liaison for graft-related incidents. I have a patient, a human, 26 years old, dock injury, nerve crush similar to your own case file, and his regeneration curve has exceeded even the revised deathworld baseline protocol thresholds by a significant margin. My station's compliance office is discussing a Tier 2 review. I did not want to wait for that discussion to conclude before contacting someone who has actually lived through what my patient is currently experiencing." Wren felt something settle in her chest, cold and clear and immediately purposeful, the same feeling she'd had lying on a table with a failed anesthetic block, watching the ceiling, refusing to make a sound. "Put me through to him," she said, "and send me his numbers. All of them going back to intake." The patient's name was Joran Hale, and when his face came up on the secondary channel, pale and sweating and scared in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with not understanding what his own body was doing to him, Wren recognized the particular quality of that fear immediately, because she had worn it herself, alone in a fishbowl ward, 4 months and a lifetime ago. "They think something's wrong with me," Joran said before she'd said a word. "My hand keeps closing on its own. I can hear things through the wall I shouldn't be able to hear. Nobody will tell me if that's normal, or if I'm about to get shipped off to some containment station." "Nothing is wrong with you," Wren said, and heard in her own voice the exact flat certainty Vantry had used on her, months ago, in a room that had felt a great deal more frightening before someone said those words out loud. "Your body is doing exactly what mine did. It's not betraying you. It's not being weaponized. It's healing the way our species has always healed, faster than anybody's charts expected, because our charts were never built with us in mind until about 4 months ago. You are not the first person this has happened to, Joran. You're not even the 10th. I promise you, by the time your graft's fully settled, you're going to be stronger and faster and steadier than you've ever been in your life. And none of it is going to cost you anything you didn't already have a right to." "They're talking about a review board," Joran said, "like they did with you." "Then I'm going to make sure that board has every piece of data it needs before it ever convenes," Wren said. So it takes them 40 minutes instead of 48 hours, and nobody sends an extraction team to your door at 4 in the morning. That's my job now. You don't have to fight the whole conquered bureaucracy by yourself the way I had to. That's the entire point of what I've spent the last 4 months building. She held his gaze through the channel steady and watched some of the raw fear in his face settle, not all the way gone, but no longer alone in the room with him. Breathe. Let the doctor run her scans. I'm sending her the full bellwether protocol right now, and I'm going to stay on this channel until your local board convenes, however long that takes. You are not going anywhere you don't choose to go. It took 11 hours, not 48, for Merrow's Anchor's compliance office to close the file, citing the bellwether precedent and the amended Article 40 guidance almost word for word, and Wren stayed on some version of that channel, sleeping in shifts, Des covering her office in the mornings once word reached him what was happening, Vantry sending supplementary data from 3 systems away without being asked. Until the moment Joran Hale's local physician confirmed, with visible relief, that no transfer order would be filed, and no Tier 2 response would ever be summoned. Corvith found her in her office 2 days later, once the incident had cleared her desk and made its way, inevitably, into the small informal network of station administrators who talked to each other more than any official channel ever recorded. He stood in the doorway a moment before she noticed him, the way he'd once stood in the fishbowl doorway with an extraction order in hand, though nothing else about his bearing matched that memory anymore. I read the transcript, he said, the Merrow's Anchor incident. 11 hours instead of 8 weeks, a compliance board that closed the file citing your protocol almost verbatim, and a young man who never had to disarm a security team to prove he wasn't a threat. He came further into the room, and there was something in his narrow face that Wren had learned, over 4 months, to read as close as the Uxari came to open admiration. I have spent my entire career enforcing an article written to prevent atrocities. I did not expect, at this point in that career, to watch someone quietly dismantle the fear the article was built on, one patient file at a time, from a desk the size of a supply closet. It's not dismantled, Wren said. It's one Tier 2 response that never got authorized. There are going to be more incidents, more scared administrators, more boards that convene at 4 in the morning, because somebody's afraid of a number on a chart. Yes, Corvith said. There will be, but I have also read the revised interstation guidance my own office issued 3 weeks ago, the one that cites bellwether case file designation Deathworld baseline directly in its opening clause, and I find myself, for the first time in 11 years enforcing this article, glad to have been wrong about something as thoroughly and as publicly as I was wrong about you. He paused at the door, the same dry near humor from months earlier flickering briefly across his face. My officer with the sore wrist asked me to pass along a message, incidentally. She has been promoted to training coordinator for the security office, largely on the strength of what she calls her field experience with rapid threat reassessment. She wanted you to know that she still tells the story, and that it is, and I am quoting her directly, the best thing that has ever happened to her career. Wren laughed, the sound coming easier now than it ever had in the fishbowl months ago, and Corvith, watching her, allowed himself something that on an Uxari face might have counted, if you knew how to look for it, as a genuine smile. She wrote to her mother that same week, the first real letter she'd sent home since the accident, though she'd sent short, reassuring messages through the worst of it, careful not to worry a woman 3 jumps and 1 demarcation line away, who had no way to help, and every reason to be afraid if she knew the full shape of what her daughter had survived. I got hurt on the job, she wrote, sitting at the small desk in the liaison office late one evening, Castamir's gray curve dim outside the window. Bad enough that I thought for a while I might lose the arm. The alien surgeon who treated me did everything right, and my body still didn't do what either of us expected. Turns out we heal faster than they know what to do without here, Ma. Turns out that scared some people badly enough that they tried to lock me up over it. I want you to know I'm all right. Better than all right, I've got a new job now, helping make sure the next person this happens to doesn't have to go through what I went through to be believed. I think about that porch light you used to leave on for me whenever I worked a late shift back home, how you always said the light didn't do anything. The door wasn't going to lock itself against something coming up the walk, but it meant somebody was watching for you regardless. That's basically the job now. I'm the porch light for 41 people a long way from home, and a few thousand more who haven't gotten hurt yet but will, eventually, because that's the nature of the work we do out here. I'm good at it. I think you'd be proud of the way I'm good at it. Not loud, not showy, just steady. The way you raised me to be steady. Her mother's reply took 11 days to arrive across the jump relays, and was shorter than Wren expected, and said, in her mother's characteristically blunt handwriting scanned and transmitted across 140 light years. I raised you steady because the world never once gave either of us the luxury of being anything else. I'm glad it finally paid off somewhere that noticed. Come home when you can. The porch light's still on. Wren read that message 4 times before she filed it, carefully, in the small personal folder on her desk slate where she kept the things worth keeping. Alongside the wooden bird Des had brought her in the fishbowl ward, which had traveled with her from the ward to her new quarters to the desk she now sat behind most days, its lopsided carving no less crude for having survived the trip. The dock work never fully left her life, even after the liaison office became her primary assignment. She kept a standing arrangement with the shift supervisor to cover cargo rotations twice a month, not because Bellwether needed the extra hands, but because there was something in the plain, physical certainty of guiding a pallet into its cradle, feeling the weight settle exactly where it belonged, that the desk work couldn't replace, and she had learned, over the year that followed the accident, not to give up the things that kept her honest about who she'd been before all of it. Petra made rigger lead status 8 months after the accident, the youngest on Bellwether ever to hold the position, and insisted, over Wren's mild objection, that the promotion ceremony include a formal thank you that named the exact shift, the exact pallet number, and the exact 0.4 of a second that had changed the shape of both their lives, because Petra had decided, somewhere in the year since, that some debts were worth saying out loud instead of just carrying quietly. There was a morning, 7 months into the new position, when the honest weight of the dock work paid for itself in a way that never made it into any protocol document. Wren was covering a shift alone in a secondary hold when she heard, under the ordinary clatter of loading machinery, a faint, irregular ticking in the rhythm of a support strut 2 bays over. Nothing any other worker on that floor could have picked out from the ambient noise, nothing any sensor array was tuned to flag. Just a half-second of wrongness in a sound that should have been perfectly even. She crossed the hold before she had finished deciding to, found the strut's mounting bolt sheared halfway through and about to let a support gantry drop onto an unoccupied walkway below, and had the section cleared and flagged for emergency maintenance 9 minutes before the next shift would have walked directly under it. Nobody made a ceremony of it. Vasher logged it dryly, as further supporting data for a classification that no longer needed defending on Bellwether itself, and Wren herself thought little more of it than she thought of catching a falling data slate off a side table. A reflex, not a triumph, the ordinary unglamorous shape of a body doing what it had always quietly been capable of, now simply given the room to do it in the open instead of being feared for it. It was, she thought afterward, exactly the kind of small, unremarkable save that never made it into a case file at all, and exactly the kind she had signed up to spend the rest of her working life making sure kept happening, quietly, one shift at a time, whether or not anyone ever wrote it down. Des transferred to the liaison office himself, 6 months in, not because he had any particular medical or diplomatic training, but because Wren needed someone who understood dock schedules and cargo manifests to help track which new human arrivals were most likely to end up needing the office's services before they ever set foot in a surgical bay. And there was nobody on the station who understood the rhythm of that work better than a man who'd spent a decade reading load manifests for a living. Vantry published his findings on human regenerative baseline biology 14 months after Wren's accident, in a paper that ran, at her specific and repeated insistence, under both their names, a joint authorship that a Thren medical journal editor had initially balked at, citing precedent that patients did not typically co-author the papers written about their own cases. And Vantry had responded, according to the account he gave Wren afterward with visible satisfaction, that this particular patient had contributed more original clinical insight to the case than most of his surgical colleagues managed in a career, and the editor could either print both names or find another journal willing to publish groundbreaking cross-species regenerative data without them. The paper changed how 61 conquered stations handled human medical intake within its first year in circulation. Wren did not attend most of the conferences where it was discussed, being, by her own admission, no scholar and having no particular interest in standing at a podium explaining her own nervous system to rooms full of specialists who could read the data as well as she could live inside it. But she read every citation that came back to her office over the following months and found, in the quiet accumulation of small procedural changes across the Concord, a briefing document rewritten here, a Tier 2 protocol amended there, a compliance officer somewhere 3 systems over pausing for 1 extra beat before authorizing an extraction order, the actual shape of what she'd built. Not a single dramatic victory. 1,000 small ones, each one a person who never had to learn, the hard way, what her own body was capable of before someone finally believed her about it. A little over a year after the accident, on an ordinary morning that started like every other ordinary morning on Bellwether Ring, Wren was called down to the ward, not the fishbowl anymore, that section having been quietly redesignated as a standard monitored recovery room once its brief notorious history had faded into station folklore, but the same wing, the same transparent walls, the same slow gray light off Castamere, because a new patient had come in overnight. A hauler named Soren Alding, 20 years old, 6 days off the transport from Earth on his very first labor visa contract, his left leg crushed under a shifted crate in an accident that had nothing to do with anyone's negligence and everything to do with the ordinary, unglamorous danger of the work they all did out here. He was frightened when Wren found him, the particular quiet, contained fear of a young man raised to believe fear wasn't something you showed a stranger, lying rigid in the recovery bed with his leg in a stasis sleeve, and his jaw set the way Wren remembered her own jaw being set, over a year ago now, on a table with a failed anesthetic block, refusing to make a sound. "Soren," she said, pulling a chair up beside the bed, not the desk-side manner of a liaison officer but the plain, unhurried voice of someone who had once been exactly where he was now. "I'm Wren. I run the Human Affairs office here. I want to tell you a few things before Dr. Vantry's team comes in to talk protocol, and I want you to know up front that everything I'm about to say is going to sound strange, and none of it is bad news." "They already ran a scan," Soren said, voice tight. "The nurse looked at it a second too long. I've heard that means something's wrong." "It doesn't," Wren said. "It means your body's about to start doing something faster and stranger than anybody's charts are built for," and the nurse was surprised, not worried. "There's a difference, and it took me 2 very hard weeks to learn it, which is exactly why I'm sitting here now, so you don't have to learn it the same way." She reached over and set a printed copy of the plain language briefing document on the side table beside his bed. "The one that opened with your nervous system is not broken, and it is not a weapon, dog-eared now from having been handed to dozens of frightened new patients over the past year. Read that when you're ready. Ask me anything it doesn't answer. And when your hand starts closing into a fist on its own around week 2, which it will, I want you to call my office before you call anyone else, because I promise you, whatever it feels like from the inside, I've already lived through it, and I can tell you exactly what's coming next." Soren looked at her for a long moment, some of the rigid fear in his jaw loosening, not all at once but visibly, the way ice loosens at the edges before it breaks apart entirely. "Havard Meeks told me about you," he said. "On the transport out. He's retired down on the surface now, did you know that? Runs some kind of tea stall near the shuttle port. Told every human on that transport your name before we'd even docked. Said if anything ever went wrong out here, find Ren Iskander first and worry about the paperwork second." Ren felt something warm settle behind her ribs, unexpected, and let herself sit with it a moment before she answered. "That sounds like him," she said. "Stubborn old man never did learn to stop handing out advice to strangers." She stood, smoothing the front of her uniform, the same steady economy of motion that had once cleared a room of 3 armed officers in under 5 seconds and now, more often, spent its days on smaller, quieter work, a hand on a frightened patient's shoulder, a signature on a revised protocol, a voice on a comms channel 4 jumps away telling a scared young man his hand wasn't betraying him. "Rest, Soren. Read the document. I'll be back this afternoon, and I'm not going anywhere until you're out of this bed and back on the dock, whether that takes 2 weeks or 2 months." She left him there, in a room that had once held her own fear and her own defiance, and had since become, quietly, one of the places on Bellwether Ring where that fear got interrupted before it had the chance to calcify into something worse, and walked the long corridor back toward her office, past the practice mats where Ressa was running a fresh set of junior officers through a drill that had, Ren noticed with quiet satisfaction, begun to include restraint techniques calibrated specifically for a species everyone on the station now understood well enough not to be afraid of. Vantry found her later that evening in the small break room behind the liaison office, the one with a real window instead of a viewport screen, nursing a cup of the terrible station-issue coffee that Des still insisted on stocking despite 18 months of everyone agreeing it was undrinkable, and sat down across from her with the particular unhurried stillness that Ren had learned over a year and a half meant he had something on his mind worth saying carefully. "The Central Compliance Office sent formal notice today," he said. "The Deathworld baseline classification has been ratified permanently, Concord-wide, no longer provisional pending review. It is, as of this afternoon, simply how your species is cataloged. Which means, among other things, that the story of exactly how that classification came to exist, an injured dockhand, a failed anesthetic block, a graft that refused to behave, is now written into the permanent record of Concord biological standards, cited in full, your name included, every time a species representative studies how the article is meant to be applied." "That's a strange thing to have your name attached to," Ren said. "A medical footnote in a filing system nobody reads for fun." "Perhaps," Vantry said, "or perhaps it is simply the shape a legacy takes when the person building it was never interested in it looking like one." He turned his cup slowly in his long gray fingers, considering something. "I have been practicing medicine for 32 years now, Ms. Iskander. I have grafted nerves into 9 different species, watched hundreds of patients heal or fail to heal, filed reports that changed nothing and reports that changed a great deal. And in all that time, I never once had a patient teach me something about my own field that I did not already believe I understood. You did that in the space of about 8 weeks, and you did it not by being extraordinary in the way I expected, not by displaying some dramatic new capability I had never seen, but by being ordinary in a way none of my training had prepared me to recognize, calm under a threat that should have provoked panic, restrained with a strength that should, by every model I had, have provoked violence. I keep turning that over. I do not think I will ever fully stop turning it over." "Havard has a theory about that," Ren said, half a smile at the corner of her mouth. "He says it's not that we're calmer than everyone else. It's that our whole world never gave us the luxury of panicking and surviving both, so the ones of us still standing simply don't know how to do the first thing anymore. Something about evolution filtering out the flinch, generation by generation, until what's left just doesn't flinch, and calls it ordinary because it never got the chance to call it anything else. That, Vantry said, is either the bleakest explanation for human resilience I have heard in 18 months or the most honest one, possibly both. Havard usually manages both at the same time, Wren said. It's his particular gift. They sat a while longer in comfortable silence, the window beside them showing Castamir's slow gray curve deepening toward the artificial dusk cycle the station ran on, and Wren thought, not for the first time, that the strangest part of the last 18 months was not the arm, not the reflexes, not even the compliance board and the extraction attempt, and the long, careful work of building something out of the wreckage, of nearly losing everything to a fear nobody had bothered to check against the facts first. The strangest part was how ordinary it had all become, how a room full of aliens who had once looked at her like a live threat now looked at her, most days, like a colleague, a neighbor, a woman who ran a small office near the docks and still covered cargo shifts twice a month because she liked the honest weight of the work. Deathworld Baseline, Class 14. A designation in a filing system, a footnote in a medical journal, a line item in a treaty amendment 300 pages long that almost nobody outside the Concord's own bureaucracy would ever read in full. It was not the kind of legacy that made for a good story told in a break room over bad coffee. It was, she thought, exactly the kind that mattered. The appeal came 8 months after the ratification, and it came, Wren learned when Vasher summoned her to the command office to deliver the news personally, from a source none of them had fully anticipated, not a frightened Concord bureaucrat this time, but a formal challenge filed by the diplomatic mission of a species called the Revesk, small, chitinous, long-lived, whose homeworld had been nearly depopulated 4 centuries earlier by an engineered supersoldier program gone wrong, a war that had, according to the historical annex attached to their filing, killed 1 Revesk in every 3 before the augmentation could be contained. They had not been party to the original bellwether hearing. They had, as a matter of standing Concord treaty right, 6 months to file a formal review of any precedent-setting Article 40 ruling, and they had used every one of those 6 months to build a case. They are not accusing you of anything, Vasher said, sliding the filing across her desk for Wren to read. Their argument is more careful than that and considerably harder to answer. They argue that the bellwether ruling was decided on the strength of a single individual's demonstrated restraint, under a single set of circumstances, and that basing a permanent species-wide classification on one case, however well documented, sets a dangerous precedent for exactly the kind of catastrophic misjudgment that cost them 1/3 of their population 400 years ago. They are asking the Central Compliance Office to suspend the Deathworld Baseline classification, pending a fuller multi-generational study, and to reinstate provisional Article 40 monitoring on all human client labor populations in the interim. Wren read the filing twice slowly, and felt none of the cold fear she might once have expected to feel at the words reinstate provisional Article 40 monitoring, only the familiar, focused stillness that had carried her through every hard thing since the pallet had come down 2 years before. How many humans are currently working Concord stations under this classification? Just under 4,000, Vasher said, across 61 stations as of last month's count. If the appeal succeeds, every one of them reverts to provisional status tomorrow. Every graft, every injury, every ordinary workplace accident becomes, again, a potential compliance incident instead of a medical one. The review convened 5 weeks later, not on Bellwether this time but at the Central Compliance Office itself, 3 jumps coreward, in a chamber considerably larger and colder than the cargo arbitration room where Wren's own hearing had taken place, and Wren traveled to it with Vantry, with Corvith, who had by then been formally seconded to the Compliance Office's ongoing Human Affairs Review Board and had petitioned successfully for standing to testify, and at her own insistence. With Joran Hale, the young hauler from Marrow's Anchor whose case had closed in 11 hours instead of 8 weeks, because Wren had learned, in 2 years of doing this work, that the most convincing evidence was never her own case alone. It was the second case, the third, the proof that what had happened on Bellwether was not an anomaly but the first entry in a pattern. The Revesque delegation was smaller than she expected, 3 representatives, their chitinous exoskeletons a deep, matte black that seemed to drink the chamber's light, their spokesperson an elder named Threl Kova whose voice, when she rose to open the review, carried a weight of old grief that no translation software could fully soften. "I do not doubt the sincerity of the individuals in this room," Threl Kova said, addressing the tribunal directly, though her dark, faceted eyes moved once briefly to Wren. "I have read the transcripts of the Bellwether hearing. I find the restraint demonstrated there genuinely remarkable, but my people learned at catastrophic cost that remarkable restraint in one generation, under careful observation, in a controlled environment with every incentive to behave well, does not guarantee anything at all about the generation that follows it, once the observation relaxes and the incentives change. Our engineered soldiers were calm too in the beginning, gentle even. It took 11 years before the first one stopped answering to any authority but its own judgment, and by then there were 40,000 of them, and no one left with the capability to explain to them why they should stop." She turned, finally, to face Wren directly. "I am not accusing you of anything, Ms. Iskander. I am telling this tribunal that a species is not its best individual case file, however good that case file is. I would ask this board to consider what protection exists for the next 4 centuries, not merely the last 2 years." The tribunal was silent for a long moment after she sat down, and Wren, when the arbitrator's gesture invited her to respond, stood slowly, and found that what came to her was not an argument built to counter Threl Kova's fear, but something closer to an answer built to honor it. "I can't promise you what my species will look like in 400 years, Wren said. "Nobody can promise that about any species, including yours, including the conquered itself. I won't stand here and pretend restraint is a genetic guarantee, because it isn't for us any more than for you. But I'd ask the board to look at what's actually different between your history and the file in front of it. Your soldiers were built by authority, for a purpose, answerable to a command structure that could order them to stop being gentle the moment gentleness stopped being useful. Nobody built me. Nobody built Joran, sitting behind me, whose whole nervous system did exactly what mine did with no one commanding either of us to do anything at all. What you're afraid of is a leash that gets cut. I'm asking you to look at the actual data and see that there was never a leash to begin with, just people, generation after generation, choosing on our own, without orders, not to be the worst thing we're capable of being. That choice doesn't come with a guarantee, but it also doesn't come with an off switch some future authority might someday remove. It's not a program that can be corrupted by whoever holds the command codes, because nobody's ever held them. It was never anybody's to command in the first place. That's not certainty, Elder Kova. I understand you wanted certainty and I can't give you that. But I'd ask you to consider that ungoverned and unbuilt might, in this one specific case, be a different kind of safety than the one your history taught you to fear." The tribunal deliberated for 3 days, the longest of Wren's life since the original 48-hour window on Bellwether, and when the ruling came down, it did not fully satisfy either side, which Vantry told her afterward, in his careful clinical way, was usually the sign of a ruling that had actually been argued honestly rather than simply won. The Deathworld baseline classification was upheld in full, the tribunal citing Wren's testimony directly in its written finding, but a new provision was added at the Revesque delegation's request, and to Wren's own surprise, at her own eventual agreement. a standing multi-generational review clause, requiring the classification's underlying data to be reassessed every 25 years by an independent board that included, permanently, a RevEsque representative among its members. A formal acknowledgement that vigilance and trust were not, in fact, opposites, and could sit in the same treaty clause without canceling each other out. Threlkova found Wren afterward, in the chamber's outer corridor, and the two of them stood a moment in a silence that had nothing hostile left in it. "I still do not know if I am right to have argued this," the elder said, "only that I could not, in good conscience, have not argued it." "I'd have thought less of you if you hadn't," Wren said, and meant it. "You lost a third of your people to a mistake nobody caught in time. I'd rather stand in front of a board with someone like you checking the data every 25 years than stand in front of one that never asks the question again because it got comfortable. That's not an insult, Elder. That's the whole reason I trust the outcome." Threlkova studied her a moment longer, dark-faceted eyes unreadable, and then inclined her head, a gesture Wren had come to recognize, across a dozen species now, as something close to respect earned rather than given. "Then perhaps," she said, "we have both done our people some good today in different directions for the same reason." She turned to go and paused. "I hope, Ms. Iskander, that in 25 years when the review comes due again, it finds nothing to be alarmed about." "So do I," Wren said, "but I'd rather it look properly and find nothing than not look at all and hope for the best. That's not fear, Elder. That's just good practice. I learned that part from a very old man who used to run a hospital ward with nothing but a cane and 40 years of hard-won patience." A little more than 2 years after the pallet came down in the number 4 hold of the Corson line, Wren pulled a cargo shift on Bellwether's main dock, the way she still did twice a month, because the honest weight of the work had never stopped meaning something to her even after the desk, and the title and the medical journal footnote had become the larger shape of her days. The hold was quiet that morning, just her, and a new junior rigger named Tama Osai, Petra's younger cousin, freshly arrived on her first labor visa. Nervous in the particular way every new arrival was nervous during their first weeks on a station that ran on conquered machinery, built to tolerances that assumed a slower, more cautious species than the one now working it. Wren had asked for her specifically when the rotation schedule came up, because she remembered what it felt like to be the newest, smallest, most replaceable person in a hold full of 11-ton cargo, and because some debts, she had learned from Petra, were worth paying forward rather than simply carrying. "Containment fields reading soft on Cradle 3, Thomas said, checking her handheld scanner, a thin note of worry in her voice. "Probably nothing. Probably just needs recalibration." Wren crossed the hold without hurrying, the same unhurried economy of motion that had once cleared a room of 3 armed officers, and checked the readout herself. Soft, yes, a flicker in the containment fields holding strength, nothing dramatic, the kind of minor fluctuation that happened on aging equipment a dozen times a shift and meant nothing 9 times out of 10. It also happened to be the exact kind of flicker that, 2 years ago almost to the day, had meant everything. "Get clear," Wren said, not raising her voice, just stating it, the same flat certainty she'd used on a 19-year-old girl 2 years before. "Cradle 3, full clearance now." Tama didn't argue. She'd heard the story. Everyone on Bellwether had heard the story, one version or another, embellished by 2 years of retelling in break rooms and mess halls, until it had taken on the particular polish of station folklore, and she moved without hesitation, backing well clear of the cradle's fall radius while Wren keyed the manual override on the loading control panel. Thumb steady on the release that would drop the cargo safely into its secondary catch bed, rather than let a failing field drop it wherever gravity and momentum decided. The field held in the end. The recalibration Tama had guessed it turned out to be all that was needed, and the pallet settled into its cradle without incident, without drama, without 11 tons of ore ever threatening to fall on anyone at all. It was, by any ordinary measure, a non-event, a soft reading, a precaution taken, a young rigger sent clear of a risk that never materialized. But Wren stood there a moment longer than the moment required, one hand still resting on the override panel, and let herself feel, briefly, the particular quiet satisfaction of a threat that simply never got the chance to become a story at all. Not every dangerous moment needed an ending like hers. Most of the time, the whole job, the whole point of standing where she stood now, in the hold and in the liaison office both, was making sure it never had to. "You all right?" Tama asked, once the pallet had settled and the hold had gone quiet again. "I'm fine," Wren said, and meant it the way she'd meant it 2 years ago on a shuttle out to Bellwether, arm dead at her side, asking Des for a coffee like it was the only thing that mattered. "Just old habits, come on. Let's get this hold cleared before the next shift's due." They finished the load together, the two of them, working in the easy, unhurried rhythm of people who trusted the ground under their feet and the machinery around them, and, increasingly, each other. And when the shift ended, Wren walked back through the ring's long gray corridors, toward the small office near the docks where a briefing document with her handwriting, still buried somewhere in its footnotes, waited for whoever needed it next. She passed the ward on the way, the same wing that had once been the fishbowl, and glanced through the transparent wall out of nothing more than habit, and saw Vantry there, mid-consultation with a new patient she didn't recognize, gold eyes calm and unhurried over a data slate, explaining something in the careful clinical cadence she'd once found so hard to read and now understood completely. He caught sight of her through the wall and gave a small, precise nod, the kind of acknowledgement that had replaced, over 2 years, whatever wariness had first stood between them, and Wren nodded back and kept walking, because the patient inside needed his full attention more than she needed a longer hello. Havard's tea stall, she'd heard, was doing steady business down on the surface, and he still told the story to every new human transport that came through, embellishing it a little more each time, the way old men were entitled to do with the stories that mattered to them. Des ran half the liaison office's day-to-day scheduling now, sharp and competent in a way the docs had never quite let him show. Petra had made shift supervisor. Ressa trained new security officers in restraint techniques that no longer assumed every unfamiliar strength was a threat waiting to happen. And somewhere, 140 light-years away and closer, on stations Wren had never visited and never would, humans who got hurt on the job were being told, calmly, by physicians who finally had the data to say it plainly, that their bodies weren't betraying them. Soren Aldine walked out of the ward under his own power 6 weeks after his crushed leg first came under Vantry's care. No cane, no drag, the stasis sleeve long since retired, and stopped by the liaison office on his way back to dock duty to return the dog-eared briefing document Wren had given him on his first frightened morning at Bellwether. "Figured you'd want it back," he said, setting it on her desk, "seeing as half the pages are held together with tape now." "Keep it," Wren said. "Every new arrival's going to need a copy sooner or later, and that one's already survived being read by somebody scared enough to actually pay attention to every word of it. That matters more than clean pages." She looked him over, steadier now than the rigid, frightened young man who'd first refused to make a sound, the same particular stillness settling into him that she recognized from her own reflection 2 years before, and from Petra's, and from a dozen others since. "How's the leg?" "Better than it was before the accident, if I'm honest," Soren said, a little sheepish about admitting it, the way most of them were at first. "Feels strange to say that out loud." "Say it anyway," Wren told him. "Took me a long while to stop being ashamed of it too. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just what we are, once somebody finally gives us the room to be it without being afraid of us for it." She nodded toward the door. "Go on. Ressa's running a new intake orientation on the practice mats this afternoon, and she asked me to send over anybody who's cleared for light duty. Might as well be you. He left, and Ren sat a moment with the taped-together briefing document in her hands, thinking about how many hands it had passed through since the night she'd first sketched its opening line on a data slate in a room that had once been called the fishbowl, and how many more it would pass through in the years ahead, long after her own name had faded from the front of anyone's mind and settled, quietly, into the kind of footnote that mattered more for what it had made possible than for what it had cost to write. That evening, alone in her quarters, Ren sat by the window with the small carved wooden bird from a foil coffee pouch and a scared 19-year-old's gratitude sitting on the sill where it had sat for 2 years now, and looked out at Castamir's slow gray turn, and thought about the monitor that had screamed above a surgical table on the worst morning of her life, and about how she had been in that room the calmest person in it, without ever once deciding to be. It had simply always been true. It had just taken a crushed nerve, a synthetic bridge her own body refused to leave alone, and a whole frightened system built to measure threats instead of people, to make anyone else finally notice. She flexed her right hand once, fingers closing and opening smooth and sure in the low evening light, an arm that had once been counted dead below the shoulder and was now, by every measure anyone had bothered to take, simply and completely hers. Then she set the coffee pouch bird carefully back on the sill, turned off the light, and went to bed, unhurried, unafraid, exactly as steady as she had always been, long before anyone else had the sense to notice, and long after it had stopped needing anyone's permission to be true.